diagnoses that supposedly are not related to childhood trauma and are instead related to genetic problems and biological problems and chemical imbalances. The fraud of science, science that doesn't really want to ask questions about what really happened to children. Science, by definition, the search for truth, which in the hands of people in denial, scientists in denial, becomes instead a quest to block, to deny, to refract, to defend abusers with all these diagnoses and labels, and then instead of helping people look at what happened to them, give them a context where they can be loved for who they really are, help them really study themselves, help them build a new family based on love and respect and empathy and truth. Instead, well, let's give them pills and let's give them some different technique which will help them work out the surface of their problem, just on the surface. Let's give them CBT and DBT and this one and that one and this one and lots of codes and fancy sounding stuff that doesn't get to the heart of what the issue is and isn't intended to get to the heart. Because when people say, I didn't have a good childhood, the heart gets opened. Then truthful questions can be asked. Open questions can be asked. Questions that have answers that, well, don't protect the family. Don't protect society. Don't protect school and siblings and religion and politicians and leaders. Questions instead that have answers that lead to anger, injustice, frustration, sadness, bitterness, and then tears of grieving. The only way to heal from a childhood that wasn't so good.
Hello and welcome to Health Revealed Part 4, where we are detailing the deeper essences of this problem that we are finding out is rather important to look at. This idea of statism, this belief system that a lot of people have within our world. What can we observe more about this belief system? I'm joined here by Stephanie Mo Davis, Leslie Powers, and Scott Gordon. Say hello, everybody.
Hello, hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
Hello.
Yes. We welcome your input on this as we delve deeper. We're going to talk more about the ego through ponerology, as we mentioned before. When three egos govern, Andrew mentions, egoism, egotism, and egocentrism, the feelings of social links and responsibility toward others disappear, and the society in question splinters into groups ever more hostile to each other. When a hysterical environment stops differentiating the opinions of limited, not quite normal people from those of normal, reasonable persons, this opens the door for activation of the pathological factors of a various nature to enter in. And you might notice as we go further, this idea of the normal, right? And the norm versus these outliers or these outcasts. And, how does that play into health, right? I mean, obviously we talked about the problems before of like labeling and identifying and putting all these people in certain groups. Well, there's certain people who just don't really fit into those groups. So what about those individuals, right? So here we have a quote from Eric Fromm, and if you do a lot of research on authoritarianism and this idea of the authority figure, you will come across his works quite often. He says, man has continued to evolve by acts of disobedience. Not only was his spiritual development possible only because there were men who dared to say no to the powers that be in the name of their conscience or their faith, but also his intellectual development was dependent on the capacity for him being disobedient. So I find that to be rather relevant to what we talked about before, right? We talked about religion through Dr. Carl Jung's perspective as a means that can revolt against the powers that be. And, he's saying spiritual development. And here we see intellectual development and this concept called the conscience, right? Which is perhaps our decision-making ability, choosing right action over wrong action. We see that was suppressed through the Dr. Stanley Milgram experiments. Of course, this relates to evolution and how humanity is evolving in time. Of course, we had barbaric ages of war and conquest. We talked before about slavery, right? And all these crazy worldviews that have been kept for thousands of years. So moving past that, that is certainly an intellectual development.
It's really interesting to me to think that our species can de-evolve through being compliant and not challenging the status quo.
Yeah, due to our programming, it sounds almost counterintuitive that by becoming a little more disobedient, that we're actually going to increase our freedom and morality. So that's something for people to look at. It took me a long time to process that for myself, given my background.
And maybe even our intellectual capacity as a species.
Certainly interesting to think about too. Of course, we talked about all the medical practitioners who left their profession, so we can say they're the rebels, acting on their conscience of what they think might be right, as opposed to that system that they were once in. And maybe that's actually a good step for medicine, right? Is like actually practicing medicine is being disobedient to those previous forms of medicine they were a part of. And so if you build upon the premises that we've been talking about here in these presentations, a lot of this starts to come together. And you'll see some of these notions come together, like this idea of boundaries, right? So what does it mean to have boundaries? And we talk about this in Slavery Gone for Good, the book I wrote as well. And it says boundary setting is a vital skill that ensures healthy relationships with others. Without healthy boundaries, we can either have such rigid boundaries that we don't allow people to get close, or such non-existent boundaries that we give too much of ourselves to others. Without effective boundaries, unhealthy or even toxic relationships can develop, leading to severely impacted mental health and well-being. Right? What is your boundaries? Right? Does everybody have some sort of boundaries? And if they don't have any boundaries at all, they can be quite a vulnerable individual, right? Prone to manipulation. So that's why it relates here to slavery. Of course, if a slave doesn't have boundaries and says, like, this is where I own myself, this is what I own, then they're going to be easily enslaved by somebody who wants to capture them and use them to their own benefit. Another quote says, "We as individuals have every right to set boundaries with every single relationship we have, and that includes government. Why is it not okay for your friends and family to violate your boundaries, but it is okay for government to do it?" Right, here's another question, another contradiction that we're seeing here in our morality in relation to statism. He says, trauma has been used on us all on a large scale. Why? Because it scares people into dropping their boundaries. Why are we being scared into dropping our boundaries? So that we are easier to control. Perhaps the abuse of power is really just power, which is abusive by its nature. The science of creating a slave. Remove individuality and remove boundaries.
In my work, which is, psychotherapy, this is a really important topic because our boundaries really define our experience. And that was a very profound concept that really rang a bell for me in the documentary Thrive 2, This Is What It Takes. And he made this clear statement about how important boundaries are because they are like that is what defines the edges of what we experience in our lives in terms of relational interactions and pretty much everything. It's a very subtle way of thinking about self-defense is just being able to say no, or to know when we're going to stay, when we're going to walk away, what we're going to comply with and what we're not.
I would just like to add, ideally, in an enlightened society, we wouldn't need boundaries because we all wouldn't be operating from fear. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that we are on Earth School, we're learning, we're in human development, and it's healthy to have boundaries as we evolve. But the nuance with the boundaries is that as we become more self-aware and do our inner work, maybe our boundary extends a little bit. Maybe sometimes we're vulnerable or we're ill and we have to retract and pull in the boundary a little bit. So there is some nuance to boundaries. It's not just a strict wall and that's what it is. It's as we learn and grow, our boundaries do shift and become a little bit more malleable. And we have to be aware that we all should be going through this process of being more honest, transparent, loving, and compassionate. But until then, we have to have these layers of boundaries. But you got to make sure to communicate them appropriately as well. People can't read our minds.
And I think of boundaries as being like a filter where you do allow things in and other things you leave out. So it's not an all or nothing black and white thing. And it's not something that always has to stay the same. You can adapt and adjust your boundaries depending on the situation and time and place.
I think in lieu of a lot of the communication issues we see nowadays, a lot of the polarity, divide and conquer, the inability to just simply empathetically communicate with individuals. One phrase that's very simple that I hear a lot by individuals is take what resonates and leave the rest. It's a nice, very simple way to say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If something here is good, please absorb it, but don't, if something doesn't, just filter it out, as Leslie said, and let it go without having an emotional reaction about it. Take what resonates, leave the rest.
Yeah, that's a catchphrase in the 12-step program. Take what works and leave the rest, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So there's this idea then of bullying that we also perhaps may learn about at a young age, right? Having boundaries, don't get bullied, stand up for yourself, a lot of things we tell ourselves perhaps as we're growing older, and how to deal with people so we don't become manipulated or we don't manipulate other people. Well, what is mentioned as well here in the slavery book that I wrote, because this is all relevant to this idea of, a power differential between somebody who's ruling over somebody and somebody who's sort of a victim. Not that they have to be a victim, but that they can be, right? And the question is, what is the victim doing in that relationship? So a bully is someone who dominates or pressures over another with aggression, often on a consistent basis as a means of coercion to get someone to do something. It is taught so that the student, right, if we're talking about schools, can properly identify what is bullying so that they will know how to avoid and handle it. It is to prevent being bullied or being the bully themselves. Bullying involves an abuse and of power, whether it be of a mental or physical expression, right? I'm stronger than you. I'm going to oppress you because you're weaker than me. Right? Or it could be obviously much deeper than that. There can be a lot of traumas and projecting that's happening on part of the bully. It is important to remember that the dominator could be more luring, however, if you are trained to see them not as a bully, or you are raised into the condition. Right? So furthermore, we can identify bullies in one area of our life, but we may fail to identify bullies going by another name. This is the whole reason why it's taught to a lot of individuals in schools, because they're being bullied and they don't necessarily know how to escape it, or they don't recognize that it is bullying in the first place. And so it's a very dangerous relationship. It can become more dangerous over time the more is permitted. So we must understand the mental lure used among all the dominators, seeing the actions for what they are, regardless of who they are or claim to be, right? Like, I'm your protector. It's the things that some dominators may say, so that way the victim complies, right? A lot of mental games they may play with their victim, right? Like, you need me. Well, without me, I mean, you wouldn't have anything. But it's like, no, the victim can be much more than that. They don't need to be bullied at all. They don't need to have that dependence. They just need a little bit of empowerment. And that's why sometimes they need to seek out a parental figure or some friend in their life to help them work through it. And they need to escape the scenario. And that takes a lot of courage, takes a lot of internal strength, right?
That abuse of power can be also described as an abuse of authority. You can see that someone who is in a perceived sense of authority or power can coerce, pressure, abuse someone they perceive under them, and
Right.
that would be bullying, another way of describing bullying.
It gets a little complicated because there are layers of this, and this can be an invitation for the rise of the perceived weaker one, or the one who needs empowerment, or the victim per se. So it's just, when it's acted out unconsciously, it appears to be very dangerous, and there's a lot of injustice around that. And especially when the roles stay the same. when the dynamics aren't catalyzing some sort of third attractor where the bully gets put in his place and the perceived victim rises to feel more empowerment. It's just a shame that we can't be conscious about these dynamics, right? For instance, could you imagine a bully on the school playground, just instinctually picking up like a dog, weakness, perceived weakness in someone else? That's what it is. It's an instinct, just like an animal, right? So if you're an animal, you might get killed because of that. But if you're a human being, you have the ability to rise up and stand up for yourself. It's just, we don't want to coddle the victim. Sometimes in school scenarios, you see people where, the bully gets punished, the victim gets coddled, but the victim never really learns and grows, and either does necessarily the bully. They just get punished for their behavior. So I would just love to see a little bit more consciousness around the bully dynamic, period. I'm not saying that it's right, but there is, from a broader spiritual perspective, a big opportunity in somebody to realize the roles that are playing out, the archetypal patterns that are playing out, and what is the best way to counter this discomfort in the dynamic.
Understanding psychology is important here too, because bullying can ignite a fight or flight response, a stress response in the individual who's being bullied. And so understanding how the brain and nervous system operate through fight, flight, freeze, or fawn can help you understand these complex ways that people try to protect themselves and stay safe under duress, basically.
Yes.
I have a friend who's a mother, and this actually just came up very recently, where a school situation where the one son was being bullied, and my friend was telling me there's two ways you can handle this. She said you can either coddle the person being bullied and punish the victim. She said, but that's my son being victimized. I tell him, fight back. Don't just fight back. Like, stand up for yourself and fight back. Don't go run to the teacher. And so it's a different level of handling a situation, and the ability to see in the end, why is this dynamic actually, like Leslie, you're saying, why is this dynamic presenting in the first place? What is the energy involved here that maybe is unseen that's calling in this dynamic here? Right? Obviously, the bully maybe had oppressors on himself, and it's a generational trickle-down parental situation. But again, it can be very instinctual too, where a bully doesn't tend to bully another bully. Why is that? Because instinctually, there is some sort of potential opportunity for both people to learn and grow from it if you bring a conscious awareness opportunity to it.
Right. And then understanding how you hold your boundaries, whether they're energetic or behavioral, is a protective mechanism against bullying.
Yes. Yeah, and I think an important thing to mention too is this idea of abuse and of power, or abuse of power, or power by itself, as being abusive. The question is, what power are we talking about, right? Is it perceived power, or is it like somebody actually saying, I have more rights than you, I can do this to you, but you can't do that to me, type of thing? I think it would be what we're talking about here relevant to statism, right? Is like there's a particular type of power that is by its nature oppressive because it's saying that they are basically above human and that someone else is subhuman or not on the same level fundamentally by right. And so it's a very, unique way to look at it, because some people might say, somebody who has a lot of money has a lot of power, right? And that's exploitative, but maybe they earn that for themselves, right? And it's like, can you say that is abusive? Just to have that money, just to have that position in society. So I think it's just a disclaimer to throw out there for folks, right? Because obviously these ideas might get thrown out there, and there is a lot of, you'll see this on social media, people claiming to want to be the victim, and looking for what people call nowadays virtue signaling, right? Looking for validation from other people because they're missing something within themselves. So some people want to be in that victim mindset, and others want to be in that dominator mindset. But where's the middle ground? Where's just the individual who just wants to be themselves, right? Do they know themselves?
Those are great points. And I wanted to add that it can be a challenge for adults to recognize various forms of bullying because they become more hidden, more suppressed, repressed socially. And I know for me, I found it very difficult to navigate different situations. I've had some inner work in counseling, which has benefited me greatly in that I can recognize and deal with forms of bullying in some areas, and yet in others, I still feel like, and maybe what Leslie said earlier about the fight or flight response and some of the psychological mechanisms that work with the body may explain that. But also another thing that may explain that is that in the adult world, I'm not saying it's easy for kids, it's obviously not. But in the adult world where things have become a little more complicated in social relationships, including employee-employer, those kind of things, and many other areas, including healthcare roles. Any roles that we play can have a dominator and someone receiving the domination kind of dynamic. And so what I'm trying to say is basically that these dynamics can vary for different social situations, and it can be a challenge to recognize and confront and deal with bullying and domination in various areas in your life. And I know that that's been a challenge for me.
Yeah.
You know, you reminded me, Scott, of another a triangle that we may end up talking about later between the victim, aggressor, and rescuer. So when there's bullying, we could describe that bully as the villain, the aggressor, and then the victim is the one who is hurt by the aggressor. And often then that calls in a rescuer, or people will try to create a rescuer to come in. And that dynamic can set in place, you know, establish roles that are embedded and repeated, but not empowering or really solving the problem at a
I think
root
one
level.
thing that we talked about quite a lot throughout our seminars so far is we seem to be in a time in history, and as we grow up, as a child, maybe our bullying or abuse is overt. As we're getting older, what's more complicated to deal with and hard to recognize, as Scott was saying, is when things become very deeply entangled and covert, very hidden, very manipulative. You can barely see it. And you know, you may be strong enough now to deal with a bully who confronts you overtly, but when it starts to become very nuanced and very deep and very covert and very hidden and very manipulative, it feels to me that this is preying on some of our deepest and most hidden wounds. And it gets very, very difficult to be able to see. Often for me, as I'm learning and growing, some of the most difficult, deep, nuanced issues are only seen in hindsight. And I do get better by what Scott was saying, and Leslie, is how I'm navigating in this complex terrain is really going back to something simple, which is, how do I feel in this situation? What is my heart rate doing with this person in this situation? Does this feel unhealthy? Do I have a red flag that I'm not listening to? It really is turning me back to decipher who to trust, who's authentic, is really turning me back into those core principles that I had when I was a yoga teacher, which was, how does this situation make you feel? How does it really make you feel? And I realize now I do have the discernment to not run away from it because I'm afraid of it. So that's a good sign. I'm not going to run because I'm afraid or I'm unaware. So I have to go back to the feeling state and really say, how does this person make me feel? How does this situation make me feel? And then trust and act upon those feelings.
I think looking at a scenario like, as simple as it is boundaries or bullying can be powerful. We're talking about authority, we're talking about governments, we're talking about medical systems, but we're talking about all these different authority dynamics. This is like a common example that, the average child learns about. And, when we're talking about victims, ask yourself, we have all these different systems in place. Sometimes it can feel rather difficult to escape those dominator relationships, but how easy is it for the victim of government to escape that dominator relationship? I'd say probably the hardest of all these other relationships, right? Because you can have a relationship with your work that is toxic and like really difficult to try to escape. But violence is not necessarily going to be done to you if you disobey and you leave that work. Yeah, you might not have all the money in the world to do different things, and maybe, you're going to be struggling in different ways. But with government, it seems to be rather more difficult, in my view, for the victim.
That's a great point. And similarly, in therapy and healthcare, I know that I've noticed the dynamic that I have to be very careful, not just to make a safe environment for my client, but also that because of my quote unquote authority or knowledge, that I'm still helping my client to bring out their full expression of self. And that can't be done in the face of authoritarianism or a dominator attitude. So I have to bring out in the client the best of themselves and make it not only so it's safe for them to do so, but so that they're encouraged to be themselves. And I can imagine that this applies to the medical profession as well, because you have a similar type authority relationship. And yeah, as Corey pointed out, there are things with certain social situations, such as government, that there's not much room to maneuver. And there's not much you can do about certain authority situations. And so that means that those who are trying to help in the medical or therapeutic professions have to be very careful about their role and how they come across.
Mm-hmm.
I was sitting in working with a physician as a life coach counterpart or an experiencer, as someone who had severe medical issues myself, offering a listening, empathetic ear to her patients. And we were seeing patients simultaneously. And this has been said many times, and it was proven many times that when the doctor was speaking with the patient, just the white coat, the label, the everything that comes with being a doctor, the patient actually acted slightly different and discussed things differently and shared things that were more personal differently than with me, who was just a patient experiencer. So I think that we really, really need to realize that. And again, the common phrase that doctors would say to me is, how did they tell you something in 10 minutes that took me a year to get out of them? And I simply said, it's your label. I think that's just what it is that they are feeling safe. There's absolutely no judgment coming from me. I'm meeting them as an equal. So I think as time proceeds, and ironically, on the other end of that is I work with so many providers who have really severe imposter syndrome, white coat syndrome, imposter syndrome. So it's just very clear that this isn't really healthy, that it's very obvious that on both sides, we're not optimizing. So that's why I feel in the future, the roles have to change. You have to break the ego, and the physicians, maybe we have physician guides, or we change it and we be more honest. I think that's why the proclivity of coaches has risen so much, because a coach can meet someone as an equal, and often coaches have their own personal experience that they aren't afraid to talk about, which most providers within the system cannot talk about. They're limited from time, resources, and even sharing that personal experience. So I think that that way of doing things has expired. It's very clear, unless you want to attract the victim savior archetypal dynamic.
Yes. It mentions here the most potent strategies against bullies is to walk away if possible or find a way to stand up to them. And right, what do we see when people step away from the mainstream medical system, right? They attempt to walk away. Maybe they go to an alternative practice. They get less validation. They may even get censored, right? So there's a stigmatization around, standing up for your boundaries, standing up for your principles, and then possibly just standing right up to them saying, directly saying, I'm not going to put up with this, not necessarily walking away or getting away from it. And something that you mentioned, Stephanie, comes to mind. We can call this idea of the internal bully. Are we bullying ourselves? Are we trying to escape our own problems and walk away from ourselves, to become an inauthentic person, or trying to get away from ourselves and not confront the truth that we are? So, you can turn this from an external to an internal relationship, like we talked about the external and internal locus of control. And again, walking away if possible from bullies. I mean, if you talk to somebody who lives in any country of the world and they say, I don't like being in this country, someone might just say, oh, well, you should just leave this country, right? So, oh, that's walking away from a bully, but is that really walking away from a bully? And is that standing up for yourself? There's a question as to if that escapism is rather just defeatism, if it's not really empowerment.
Corey, one thing I just want to add is I think there is a clarion call historically right now in this bully tyrannical environment that certain people we all in a way find ourselves in, is it's not a learning opportunity anymore. It's something where people who are standing up, medical providers or people within the system, adults who are standing up against tyranny and standing up against what's wrong, it's not just that they're getting punished, it's that they're getting fired, they're getting ostracized, they're losing their license, and people are getting killed because of this. But something within me really feels as though we have to keep standing up to it. Mm-hmm. It's like a very high risk, high stakes game. It feels like at this point, this is nothing light anymore. This isn't a learning opportunity. We're being called to stand up to what's right. And there's a tremendous sacrifice that people are paying to stand up for what's right. But that's, I believe, what we're called to do if we're put in that position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and standing up is, I think, a responsibility towards your own personal growth and evolution, and self-respect. And, I think in schools, for example, starting young, children are discouraged from standing up for themselves in some ways, especially if that involves self-defense, and instead go to a teacher, go to an adult, go to someone else. And that then just continues as adults, where we need to go to the HR department to solve a problem or go to our supervisor. And the power is really being discouraged within ourselves to stand up for the wrong, for what's right.
Great point.
And that is then the creation of like government as a rescuer, or a doctor as a rescuer, the medical system to rescue us. It contributes to that mentality of that powerlessness within, or that it's somehow wrong to assert oneself around what's right or needed.
It's an attempt to maintain control, right? So if we lose control, if the school teacher lets the two children fight it out for a second and has an higher understanding of when to step in and when not, the children are going to witness that, and they're going to understand the repercussions of what happens when you do this kind of stuff. It's almost like we're pulling away a massive opportunity to learn out of perceived protection and control of harming others, and nobody's getting the message. Nobody's learning the lesson because there's this smother mother overprotective mentality, and nobody's learning. So the lessons are getting more intense and more intense.
Wow. Very
Add
good
to
points.
that the litigiousness of our society, and that adds to another barrier based on fear, right? That if I defend myself, I'm going to get sued, or I'm going to get misunderstood or arrested, right?
Yeah, and then now what happens if people do stand up for what is right? If people are just doing the right and balanced thing to do, they're perceived as tyrannical, conspiracy theorists. It's like somehow we've lost the whole concept of what balance, this energetic balance, actually really looks like. A lot of people I know that are standing up and getting canceled, I mean, they're being labeled as some of the, craziest rebels of all time, conspiracy theorists. And it's like, actually, no, they're actually just doing what's right. It's actually
Mm.
not extreme at all.
Yeah, we'll talk about that
Yeah.
too. You guys brought up fantastic points, frankly. And it's interesting too, what you mentioned there briefly. It's like doing right as an authority figure. It can often make a perception as if the right action, it has to be done by the authority figure, or
Mhm.
that it legitimizes the authority figure when these are two separate things.
What would do? Yeah. So then that poses, do we need the authority figure if we can do what's right organically? It's like this weird next level threat. But you're right, Corey. What a great point. Is like, I have to be the one to tell you what to do because I'm the professional.
Hmm.
You can't figure it out on yourself.
Yeah. But you see that too with our world. It's like, oh, well, this doctor or this politician, he did really good stuff for us. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't make the position inherently moral. Just because he, with his position, did that moral thing. And I think sometimes people confuse these things, right? So just something to bear in mind. You guys brought up fantastic points.
Corey, I got one more thing. I'm sorry. The last thing I want to say based off of what you just said is that if we're operating that way and a leader can provide good solutions,
Mhm.
resolutions, be that leader, a good leader never takes an imbalance of credit.
Mm,
It's like the whole system shifts energetically when we have the right leaders in charge.
it's true. Yeah, and that goes back, I think, of the Tao Te Ching, right? Which is basically like a rule book for leadership. And it says like the leader is the person who's behind, who's like on the low and with the peasants. It's like you start reading that and you wonder why it's considered the first anarchist text in history. So for any of you guys who are into spirituality, and Carl Jung said Taoism was one of the most important texts he's written, read regarding the individual. He called it an individual religion because he said it like helped you see within and highly emphasized within the text as well as that yin and yang, the masculine and feminine, which is a lot of what we've been talking about. So very interesting.
A good leader should, I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about this, but I was just going to say that I'm seeing that certain healthcare providers who have potentially done very bad things over the last couple of years are continuing to get high level awards, right? When they're being questioned for their morality on every level.
Mhm.
Any good leader with the controversy and the questioning of the public wouldn't just walk the stage like nothing's ever happened. It's just like it's very clear that in many cases we just have the wrong people running the show. Very clear.
Mhm. Yeah. And the crazy thing is how many people do recognize that to some extent, but are unable to see these deeper psychological elements, right? Because that part is a little bit more misunderstood by people. People don't necessarily look this far. So perhaps this is where the practitioner can come in to assist that process for individuals because they have it. They have it within them, that ability to know of what's going on in the deeper aspect of things. It's not that difficult too once you break it down.
When you if you're in that field and you're either adhering to what's happening, to admit a wrong is to admit that you contributed to that wrong as well in a field. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is we're sweeping again, letting certain things get swept under the rug because to admit failure of a leader in that position means that everybody under that leader has to admit their part in it, which then starts to deconstruct the system. And I think this is how we get caught in these repeated cycles and loops of dysfunction because we just don't want to admit our part in it. Like, okay, can we just stop talking about that now? That's over. That was 4 years ago. Can we stop talking about
Mm.
it? It's going to keep repeating. That's what a lot of this seminar is about. The
Yeah,
historical context that most people don't know. What
right.
happened wasn't a surprise.
And how many people will say, "Oh, well, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, right? Don't talk about it at all. Keep it outside the bound because it just causes too much division." But why? Do we ever ask ourselves like why? Like we don't just say, "Oh, well, okay, it causes so much, so let's not talk about it." But why does it though? You know? Can we have that conversation? So Continuing this, the goal is to be where a bully becomes someone who cannot bully you or anyone else anymore. And this is where, like Leslie talked about responsibility, I believe that comes in here. All these people can heal when the disease is not fed. The disease itself of bullying, right? Regardless of the bully, regardless of the victim, this relationship would not exist, right? So, as it mentions here, when the bully becomes devalued in this way, where they're not seen as a bully anymore, so to promote equality and compassion, they are not any more or less special than their victims to ever dominate over them again. In other words, since the dominator depends upon the victim, without the victim, they are deduced to nothing. So, to reiterate, the best way to prevent bullies is to turn the powerless victim into an empowered individual who exercises their self-ownership. But if you notice here, this common theme here, people treating people, just everyday people, right? Claiming to just be people, not claiming to be this bully or victim or but rather just simply themselves, right? We asked the question before, is it safe to simply be honest, to be authentic? And so the book that we wrote talking about this relationship details how this relationship with bullying is exactly parallel to government and how those who do wrong are almost always outnumbered, right? Talk about, oh, there's these select few in charge, but there's like these millions of people who follow them. And so the bully isn't asked to bully less or to just be nicer, but the bully is said not to be a bully at all, right? In school, it's like we don't want bullying at all. We don't say, well, we want a nicer bully. We should have like a different bully. We say we should just not have it at all. And you can say the same thing with slavery. It's like we wouldn't say let's go on a different plantation or get a nicer master. We'd say, no, let's abolish it. Let's have no slavery at all. Very principled. And it makes sense. So we can have compassion, but not if it's being used against us because we tolerate too much. Right? This plea for tolerance. Is it really tolerance?
And sadly, I mean, I don't like to get into this narrative of, the whole narcissist conspiracy, everything that everybody's a narcissist now. But I think sadly that we're at a state that certain bullies or people that we have running the government, they aren't going to change.
Mm.
They need to get out of office because they have a legitimate pathology or something's going
Ego,
on
yeah.
where they can't even see the harm they're doing on others. They're completely blind to it. Or worse yet, they know that they're doing it and it's pathological or psychopathic. They know that they're doing it. So I think that's where a lot of these tensions that we see right now are coming into play. Is those that are in power don't want to let it go, and they can't even see or do see how they're contributing to making it more toxic. So it is a power dynamic, a hierarchical power dynamic that's really playing out here.
I really think it's important to emphasize that we can have compassion and also hold a boundary. We can have compassion without tolerating wrongdoing.
Right.
And it takes skill and confidence to be able to hold that line. And I think that's something that we can all grow through our own practice, or through our own intention, and educating children about how to do that as well.
Non-contradicted.
It's a tough one, though, right now with leadership, because having compassion for somebody that it does have a narcissist psychopathic diagnosis doesn't work. So it's one of those things where, teaching, there's just so much nuance. There's so many layers depending on who you're with, what environment you're in. Are you working with children? Are you working with CEOs of pharma companies? Who is the person in front of you that you're working with? And how can you best link in to have a healthy relationship with that person, whether it be teach compassion, having that relationship, or literally saying, we need to find a way to get this guy out of office. It's toxic, unhealthy, and compassion actually isn't going to work in this situation with this person because they don't want to leave the power.
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
You could still have the emotion of compassion and still hold a very hard line and say, I will not tolerate you in this position. So that's the point I want to make, is I think that we don't have to turn off our humanness in order to hold our line and set a boundary and stand up for ourselves. And that how that looks is going to be different,
Yes.
depending on the situation. And and acting forgiving, so to speak, from compassion, or deciding to take your compassion and say, well, I'm going to overlook and allow you more and more chances. That's not healthy,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Very conscious, yeah, because we don't want to be reactory and say, well, because this person oppressed us, now we have to take him out of office and hang him and do all this stuff, right? Some people are looking for blood. People are looking to say we got to go with arms to fix the problem. But I think what you're hitting on is like a conscious masculine effort aligned to the conscious like feminine effort there.
Yeah, good way to put it.
Yeah, and so here's another, way to look at this scenario that's more common to the everyday person, aside from like bullies and boundaries, the simple idea of addiction, right? And we talked about how there's addiction problems happening pretty rampantly in the world. Well, what about the addiction to politics? I mean, how many people put up the signs, and how many signs do you see, and how many advertisements do you see every election season here in America? Well, here's apart from the Slavery Gone for Good book as well. Because politics makes victims of innocent people and turns them into servants for an irrational power over their will. It grows larger over time as the victim is deceived that they need more to be happy or secure. As it grows, it becomes harder to stop. The victim creates ingrained patterns of behavior and justifications for their addiction. They will often fight like their life depends on it in order to satisfy the addiction. And of course, this relates to Stockholm Syndrome. We'll touch on this soon. It says, just as the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, so too I will only smoke once a day. We have heard both lines before, shortly before it was proven false. All states hurt their population, even if they purport to protect them. So too are all addicts harmed by their addiction, either directly through physically harming the body of the victim, or indirectly through destroying their well-being and prosperity. It is a harm. The longer the victim is addicted, the greater the damage and the greater the withdrawal. So I find this to be an amazing perspective here by Nikola Pavkovic, who shared this information with us regarding this thing that he found within his own life. That he was addicted to politics, and he basically detailed this whole scenario. And it's very interesting to see these parallels. Like, are people, addicted to this thing that's actually hurting them? And this goes back to the idea of mental slavery, wanting to be a slave, not seeing that you're enslaved, protecting the slave owner, even though it's literally causing the condition that you're in. So it's what also, Leslie mentioned, it's like you want to be compassionate, but you include within that compassion some wrongdoing. That's not compassion at all. It's a contradiction. So once you recognize the contradiction, that's when you have true compassion, as we may call it, because you're able to see the bigger picture.
I see the political action as an effort of people to stand up for themselves, but in a prescripted method that has been created by a system that doesn't really want root change. But it gives an avenue for people who are unhappy, upset, feeling bullied in some way, for them to, like, okay, if you feel bullied, write your senator, go and hold a sign on the corner. And I think that part of what we're pointing out here is that those aren't actual solutions, and that it is in fact just playing along with the game of the bully.
It gives a person a safer outlet to deal with their deepest traumas, because it's externalized, it's an external locus of control where they can find other people to gang along with, to adhere to their side. So it's still a projection of what's going on within. It's a safer, normalized human projection, right?
Yes. What you just mentioned, Stephanie, reminds me of the idea we talked about before, groupthink, right? People falling into a certain ideology, unable to escape that. And, Leslie, what you touched on, it's like, can we have a more humane system? And again, back to honesty, it's not really that honest. We look at these complex systems and all these laws, we can't understand it. It's like it seems rather inhumane at the end of the day. And then we wonder why the politicians are becoming corrupt, as we call them. right? Like they're no longer human. They're not even listening to people. People complain and they don't understand the basic sentiments of the common day person. You can interview anyone on the street and they know the problems. They probably have some better solution, but yet it's not being implemented. You know what I mean? So I find that to be fascinating because it details what we're talking about. And so he goes on, the solution and how it could be the problem. He says the smoker feels irritable, and so he smokes and feels better, not realizing he is irritable because he is a smoker. So too, citizens are poor, and so when the state gifts them goods, such as shelter or police, they feel their needs are somehow alleviated, not realizing it is the state which destroys wealth and promotes poverty. This substance, the state, has fascinating properties and effects on the society which is its victim. At once, it is a stimulant causing activity where otherwise shouldn't be, like the rapid heartbeat of an economic boom and the seizure that is an economic bust. It is also a depressant, crushing activity in response where there otherwise would be, like the hampered breadth of a centralized healthcare system or the incontinence of a state environmental agency. As well, it is a hallucinogen with the profound effect that the subject imagines a heartbeat of 300 beats per minute and gasping breaths to be a normal state of affair, no matter how it harms or hampers them, right? To see how emotionally invested people become with politics. And we don't include here a lot of the photos and videos, but you can find this on archives. People not even 100 years ago in Nazi Germany and Soviet, all these regimes, people worshiping, these deity-like politicians, like saving us from communism, saving us from Nazism, which, Nazism is like a response to communism, but both we may recognize now were wrong, but yet at that time, people perceived one to be better than the other. And so that's why they were like, oh my gosh, this is so good and so great and so necessary. So they fell for a lesser evil over a greater evil, but they were still promoting evil. He continues here. He says, for a time, those who depended on the state for health care will go without health care. For a time, those who depended on the state for protection will go unprotected. But a free society will reassert itself in good health if given time to heal. As said previously, the longer the addiction goes on, the more painful the withdrawal is, as dependence has grown. Therefore, for the good of our society, the best course of action is that we release ourselves from this addiction immediately and heal as soon as possible. Wow, what a way to summarize, right? I think what we're doing here is changing the healthcare system, changing the systems that we live in, and being able to say, whoa, are we able to release from this and trust that release?
Corey, this slide makes me hopeful in a good way, and it actually makes me excited because just myself alone, I've met so many incredible individuals, you guys are among them, who have really phenomenal solutions. I mean, could we imagine that all the solutions we need to have a healthy society and to help people heal already exist? It's just about aggregating it and making this change and putting it together.
Yeah. And thank you, Nicola. If you watch this, I mean, incredible perspective, definitely that you shared regarding the subject. I think it's written quite well. And there's a lot of individuals you just mentioned, such as you guys, who I was also very fortunate to meet, where I actually interviewed over 50 different people, and I called it an ex-status compilation. So if you want to hear from somebody like Daniel Arnold, which I show here for the thumbnail, a former Marine, 25 plus years law enforcement, a trainer, author, the guy is incredible. Really had a lot of awakening that had to prompt him recognizing, wait, I had all this ego all this time. I didn't recognize I had. That's what he told me, right? To realize that there is no authority in man, and he was that authority figure, himself. He had that role, and he realized, wait, I don't have this role. I'm more than that. He called it a dark night of the soul, right? I think that's what he said in his own words. But you can check it out. We have all the interviews, and we'll have it on healthreveal.org as well. And check out. You'll see a whole compilation of interviews, and everybody's story is fascinating. Please share with us your story too. Coming across this information, we all are basically overcoming this belief system, and it's fascinating to see. It really is.
I wanted to add a plug for Mark Passio's long form video called
Yes.
Two Masks, Same Face, The Dark Origins of Nazism and Communism, just to follow up on your comments there, Corey, about how both are polarities that lead you to the same place. And Mark does a fantastic job of describing how that happened historically. Yeah.
I will say, of a lot of the people I interviewed, Mark Passio was somebody who was mentioned quite a bit, as somebody who, in a way, you can say healed these individuals. Like you listen to their experiences and you're like, wait, Mark Passio is not just sharing knowledge and information as like a content creator online. He's actually healing these people out of traumas that they never knew they had just by sharing that wisdom and information and people like giving care and taking the time to watch it. So if you think about that, it's like how many influencers are actually healing people more than the doctors in our world, right?
Right. That's why censorship is so prevalent. I think people are very privy as to what's going on. The rise in coaching, the rise in YouTube channels, just everyday people sharing how this is how I got through my neck surgery. This is how I got through this. This is how I helped my child with autism. I think they realize the tremendous threat is the people, and that's how it should be. It means we're rising and we're feeling courageous to share. But now we have to fight this upstream energy of censorship.
Mhm. Incredible. No coincidence, I would say, that the abolitionists had the printing press to their benefit to help share their message on a mass scale, which never existed before in history. Now we have technology that can spread information even more. So I think it's part of our evolution. We don't have to fear technology. We can use it as perhaps one of our greatest tools. And so, Larkin Rose is not the only individual who has detailed statism. Somebody who also has detailed this very deeply is Michael Huemer, an author and professor who wrote a book called The Problem of Political Authority. He says we could explain our behavior by citing fear of punishment, habit, the drive towards social conformity, or a general emotional drive to obey whoever holds power. But none of those explanations is emotionally satisfying. Much more pleasing is the explanation that we obey because we are conscientious and caring citizens, and we are thus making great sacrifices to do our duty and serve our society. And philosophical accounts of political authority seem designed to bolster just that image. So, and a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, people are just conforming, or people are just in fear." It's like, no, it's all those, but it's something way much more than that, right? It's something that is so deceptive that not everybody's looking at, which is this statist mentality, which is like doing good to do wrong. Being this virtuous good person who's doing their duty, actually doing the most wrong. And that right there is what he's detailing.
I don't think there's anything more pernicious than weaponizing true care.
Mm.
And it seems like that's what we're doing. We're weaponizing true care and then spinning it and scrambling it and offering a different type of a care that appears to be virtuous, but actually feeds back into that same deceptive loop.
Yes.
And by doing so, it is fueling the system through the belief that following the rules is good. That always, doing what your authority figure is telling you is good and virtuous. So that's a part of the trick.
One thing I share in almost every presentation, I think it's so critical. I like to remind ourselves and the audience watching is I was connected with a very pioneering high-level physician for an extended period of time at a supposed prestigious institution, and he would constantly remind me, you have to understand, we just provide you what you want. So we as the people need to get very clear on what we want and continue to demand that change, because the more we feed into the victim mentality, the more the system, the more the providers, the physicians, those in authority feel virtuous for that which they're providing. They feel literally like, well, we're helping you. Isn't this what you wanted? It's almost like they become blind to the whole picture until the energy of the citizen rises up and demands where we want to go.
And that's related to the people's desire to stay in a victim role and call upon a rescuer to save them from the perceived villain, which could be the disease, or it could be the system, or whatever it might be.
It's very difficult nowadays because everybody's involved. everybody's playing the victim game. It's commercialized. That's how people get capital. It's like every single organization hops onto all the victim movements. So it's asking more of you, of each individual, to stand on your own and break out of the tribe and do what it takes to walk the path of what you know best within your own heart alone. That it's like, it's the real deal now. This is the hero's journey. We're not messing around anymore. So that's the thing, is everybody needs to be aware every force is working against you.
It's almost becoming, yeah. It's becoming a
your
greater duty because you have AI now and way more extreme things that can happen within the group setting.
It's not going to get easier anytime soon, which means you got to catch up and you got to do the work within yourself, commit to the inner work, be prepared to be alone. This message needs to be shared. You know, it's pretty clear. We're in a battle and your participation is required. And when you hop on a narrative because you feel safe or comfortable or you're getting a reward from it, you may want to question what you're doing. It's just a call for everybody to really step up to do the inner work so they can discern appropriately, because the forces are just coming down on us to just buy into the same victim mentality.
Wow. Thank you guys for sharing.
Yeah.
And here, you know, Michael Huemer, he goes very deep into this. He actually has a whole section in his book talking about the psychology of statism, right? But of course, we're bringing this into a much greater detail, and into the medical system as well. He talks about the effect of wearing uniforms, and he gives actually a reference to a certain study, Bushman, 1988. He says the experiment involved having a woman tell people on the street to give a nickel to a motorist for a parking meter. Subjects were more likely to comply when the woman wore an ambiguous uniform than when she was dressed in ordinary clothes, right? As simple as an experiment as that is. And there's many videos online, actually, I've seen of college kids actually doing a similar experiment where they'll hold sign, and they'll be like, beep your horn if you see the sign, right? And then they have a police officer do it, you know, with his outfit, and he holds the same exact sign, and everybody beeps. You know what I mean? So it's very, very interesting just to see just that basic perceptual difference, for one. And he also talks about the problem of legalese, right? And we talked about this before, how the language can play a big role here, often gets underestimated. Legalese is emotionless, lacking humanity. He says, what is the effect of this peculiar way of speaking and writing? First and most obviously, that laws and legal documents are frequently incomprehensible to ordinary people. One must hire a trained professional to interpret them. Our inability to understand the law may make us reluctant to question it, while the very incomprehensibility of the law confers an air of sophistication and superiority on both the law and the lawmakers. People tend to feel respect for things they cannot understand, as well as for the people who deal with those things. This sort of respect is important if one is trying to convince others to accede to one's dominion. Normally, ordering harm to be imposed by force on other people would be a stressful occupation, whether or not the victims deserve to be harmed. The abstract technical language helps the audience and the author forget that this is what is happening, and it drains away the emotional impact of issuing coercive threats against other people.
Yeah, this is a big deal in that this legalese, this professional languaging, and often the use of initials, you know, acronyms, is really a way of creating an us versus them, separating out experts versus common people, creating division. It's a form of obfuscation or hiding of knowledge, and it's a power. It creates a power differential. It makes it difficult for people to understand what they're reading, right, or what they're hearing, and often can then play upon a person's insecurity or inner, you know, sense of maybe feeling like they're not smart enough or they're not educated enough. And that just empowers the individuals in power to make the decisions for others instead of with others.
Yes. Something I notice quite a lot, on part of my own experience, I run into individuals who read this legalese and some of which understand it, right? Individuals who do all the deep research and they're like, oh, what does this word mean? You may call them sovereign citizens or common law, American common law, whatever. And you might run across their works online or, there might be viral videos on the internet of these people claiming, oh, well, I can't, I don't have to pay taxes. I can just do this or do that. And it's very interesting to observe that, right? Coming from a psychology point of view, because they're not necessarily looking at statism and they're still playing a game of legalese. They're simply learning that game of legalese and then participating in it so that way they can try to escape from it. And I think it's important to recognize like the role of statism and simply saying no, like simply standing on your principles, simply saying I'm not going to be a part of this is very different from I'm going to use the legalese and learn how to write my name a certain way, and that is the solution. It's saying that's where the solution ends, limits our potential to move beyond that system altogether and to evolve, as we may say. So, Stockholm Syndrome is something that he details very well, Michael Huemer, in his book. He says Stockholm Syndrome is named after an incident that occurred in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973. A pair of bank robbers held four bank employees hostage for 6 days. During the ordeal, the hostages bonded emotionally with their captors, came to side with the kidnappers against the police, and seemingly did not want to be rescued. At one point, a hostage said that the robbers were protecting them from the police. On the last day, as the police used tear gas to force everyone out of the bank, the hostages refused to leave without the kidnappers, fearing that if they did so, the police would shoot the kidnappers. After the incident was over, the victims continued to sympathize with and defend the criminals. So, very, very intriguing. Absolutely. And when you connect these dots between all the different things we're saying, it's like, wow, what is really going on here? And the most ironic part too is of course we're talking about, kidnappers and criminals and then police. And it's like the police are seen as these saviors, right? Usually the good guys, but the average people. But yet, of course, we're talking about how they might actually be the worst criminals. The Tao Te Ching actually says like police are actually the most, criminal people, and the people who claim to heal are the ones causing the most sickness. It's a very ironic world that we may live in, but that doesn't make the criminals any better just because one side or another is worse, right? We talked about that before. So it can get very tricky having to navigate this. And so I encourage you guys, if you ever have to, go back to the slides or pause and read over these things for yourself.
I was just going to say, in regard to the healthcare system, is that I've had providers talk to me personally off the cuff about patients having a form of Stockholm syndrome with their illness. It's like that victim mentality, like they get caught in that praise and victim and savior mentality, but also too them not seeing themselves, their own mind control and Stockholm syndrome to their own indoctrination of their education. So it almost can seem like we've got a person over here who may need care, who's in a not necessarily healthy mindset and maybe is embodying aspects of Stockholm syndrome themselves. And then the actual perceived authority, hierarchy, provider, professional, actually in their own form of mind control or Stockholm syndrome, trying to provide the care. It's just this crazy imbalance on both ends.
Mm.
It reminds me of the position of like a house slave, supporting and defending their slave owner, right? And turning against other slaves, right? So that
Yes.
this idea of Stockholm syndrome, which is a result of trauma and the attempt of a person's system to stay safe, can lead to alignment with your perpetrator and then actually lead you to defend the perpetrator and even become aggressive or retaliatory towards other, people that are enslaved as you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Creates infighting.
And again, we have quotes from Frederick Douglass where he shares that exact experience, right? And especially in my slavery work, I mean, it's just text and text, and many slaves who have learned how to read, by the way, and write, because that was a process within itself, they detail it, right? But imagine how many that did not know how to read and write who had those same emotions and feelings. And so it's incredible to think, right? How many people are out there in the medical field or in these different industries who are afraid to speak out or don't know how to, and then creating an, like what we're doing with Health Revealed, creating a forum, an open place so we can invite collaborators and people to speak out. Hopefully we can provide you with support, during these times. And something I want to mention, Stephanie, you said, how there's Stockholm syndrome everywhere. It could even perhaps be, because this reminded me of something you said before, how people identify with their disease, right? So like they become emotionally attached to, oh, I have this disease. This is my identity. And so now they don't want to be healed because it's like part of who they are. Some people make a whole branding out of it. Like, this is what I healed and this is what I am struggling with. And so it allows them and gives them some sort of purpose in life to continue on. So something that just came to mind, like a Stockholm syndrome to our own disease.
It goes back to identity on all ends, is when you're really rigidly tied and connected to your identity, you can become blind to your own bias and get caught in loops of your own making. So even the provider, they're very connected to their identity as a healthcare provider. And we're by all means not saying that all healthcare providers are bad, but what we need to bring to awareness, which is what we're trying to do here, is the psychological underpinnings and dynamics to create something that actually propels us in a healthy forward motion where we can work on healing and not repetitive cycles of more medication, pharma, dysfunction, and disease
Right.
on all sides.
And which is ironic too, because it's like, well, if more people are healthy, there's less need for providers overall, and then you don't really need providers because people are healthy,
That
right?
should be
So,
a good problem, not a
yeah,
bad problem.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so don't, it's not that like people will be without work or there won't be people to heal. It's just that, well, isn't that the goal of health is to not have the need to talk about health? Just as the same we may talk about morality or anything else we say is essential and needed. Why are we having to talk about it so much unless we don't have it, right? So it's very interesting.
I can't help but relate it to just simply helping humanity to understand and embody, which we're all doing as well, healthy relationship, not
Hmm.
codependent relationship, not victim savior relationship, but what does a true interdependent relationship look like between a husband and a wife, between a healthcare provider and their patient, between a mother and their child? I mean, I just think we need to really actively understand that we need to move towards healing ourselves so we can have interdependent relationships over codependent relationships. I just received an email from a local hospital inviting me to come back to the primary care specialist, saying that I should be seen every few months and then I should have this test done and this test and done and this test done. And it just seems like, do they not see how codependent and needy, like, do they not trust my own discernment of making appointments for my own care? It's just
Right.
they are just feeding the codependency, and there needs to be awareness around that.
Yeah. It's a business model, it seems. Keeps you coming back. Not too healthy, not too sick.
And not trusting other human beings. We have
Hmm.
to work towards solutions that help embody empowerment. We don't want to just keep feeding this belief that providers feel that, oh, we can't trust our own patients, they don't know what they're doing. Well, instead of asking for more appointments, how about creating programs that help empower them and yourself?
Sure. Well, let's see what Michael Humer has to say about this in detailing more about Stockholm. He says basically what's involved with Stockholm Syndrome. He says is emotional closeness to the kidnappers, feeling of loyalty toward the kidnappers, which may continue long after the victims are freed, adoption of the captors' attitudes and beliefs. And by the way, on the previous point, of course, there's been collapses in history and new governments formed out of old governments. You could perhaps see this as a continuation of the belief system that they need somebody to rule over them. And so it continues a perpetuation of creating new governments that end up becoming more tyrannical than the previous, right? So there's like that instilled belief system that's still continuing even after they become free, even after a revolution or an awakening. So just something to bear in mind. He also mentions a perception of the captors as protectors and of outside forces trying to win the hostages' release as a threat, failure to take advantage of opportunities to escape, gratitude toward captors for small kindnesses and for lack of abuse. right? Thank you for not abusing me as much as you are. It's like insane, right? And again, thank you, the bully, for not bullying me as much, but still being in that relationship. Hostages often feel that they owe their lives to their captors, a tendency to deny or rationalize the captor's acts of violence, an extreme sensitivity to the captor's needs and desires.
This happens in healthcare, the pedestalization of providers through a surgery or an event. Oh, I want to come and praise my provider. They were a part of the care, but it's like we become just so single pointedly focused on finding a hero within the situation, failing to recognize our part and everything that we've done and everyone else has done for us.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm reminded of the trainings that healthcare's providers are required to take if you provide a service under the government insurance. So if you're a healthcare provider, I'm sure you are required to take these trainings. And in these trainings, there's an encouragement of whistleblowing against your own peers. If a peer breaks any of the rules, and no matter how illogical those rules are in a given situation, there's a mandate to turn in your peer, and they threaten you with fines and jail time. And it's repeated over and over and over in the training. So that for people who are trying to do the right thing or the good thing, thinking that they need to comply with these rules, they are often in situations where they're turning in their colleagues, even if their colleagues did no harm or real wrongdoing. And it is done through not communication or problem solving or a real compassionate way of solving a problem, but through telling on that person to, higher up or following a protocol. And I think that this is just really plays into this idea of all we've been talking about so far about fear and compliance. And then in this case, aligning with the bullies, aligning with this government entity that really is very disconnected from individual situations or really what's good for people. I've seen a harm done through this.
Mhm.
Leslie, this reminds me of what you were saying regarding the bully is going to the authority, right? Even as an adult, I'm thinking if I'm in that situation, wouldn't you want the two people involved to have a mature conversation regarding what's happening human to human, colleague to colleague, before rushing off to the authority figure to tell on somebody? It's such an infantile way of solving problems.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, Leslie, what you mentioned, I mean, Daniel, when I interviewed him, Daniel Arnold, I mean, he said that in the police force. I mean, there were people above him and below him, and they were all this competition between the ranks. He said that. That was a common thing he mentions as well in his book.
And Corey, this also highlights the dysfunction that plays out on the different layers amongst these systemic teams or within institutional settings. In healthcare in particular, we've got, the nurses that are having problems with the doctors and the doctors are having problems. It's like the middlemen and the administrator, they all are having issues with each other because they create these power dynamics within these layers of people that are working within the institution, which again creates a lack of coherence and health all over the place, not just within their work environment, but then that downstreams onto the patient.
Wow.
And following rules, trumps actually doing the right thing sometimes or doing something that's actually beneficial for the patient.
Yeah.
And all of this sounds strangely familiar in the function of cults. And it might be helpful to recognize the direct connection between authoritarianism, and the easily abused authority, and a cult, and how it's thought of and how it functions, and how one is going to breed the other. A cult is going to demand an authoritarian environment. An authoritarian environment is going to create a cult. And I've heard you guys describe several examples, and all I could think about was that is what a cult behaves like. You're describing a cult behavior to a T, and it's really a direct connection between authority and cult, and how we've defined cult. I mean, cult is the same as the word culture. So, the larger culture has, because we have an authoritarian government in 99% of our societies on planet Earth, we that is also our culture. So our culture is a cult as well. So, and the two are just tied together directly.
Yeah.
Well said, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And I think, we talked about culture before. It's important to understand that connection. Absolutely. It's amazing how we can connect, right? I mean, bullying and boundaries and slavery, not necessarily, I haven't really seen this been done on a scale of which we're doing it here and sharing it with the medical community and for people out there who want to heal or just want a better world. But I find it absolutely essential that people see some of these connections because, as we may recognize, there's something called the principle of correspondence in Hermeticism. It's like as above, so below. There's a lot of reflection that happens. And of course, we talked about projection before. Now,
Corey, I'm
yeah.
so grateful. I'm just really hoping that this is bringing awareness to people so we can start to truly understand that much of what we're living are within the realms of unconscious dynamics. And if we can just really share information and bring awareness to these conditions, then people can choose to do the work. At least they have the information to choose if they want to do the work or not. But sadly, I feel that the aggregate of society is just ill-informed, or they may be looking in the other direction, but I feel pretty comfortable in saying that this presentation will open many eyes.
Yes. Well, here, I mean, he lays it out. Here's the four precursors of Stockholm syndrome. So he brings it into a whole process. I love the way he breaks it down. He says, first, the captor poses a credible threat to the life of the captive victim. Right? Second, the victim perceives some form of kindness on the part of the captor. However, this kindness might consist only in a relative lack of abuse or failure to kill the victim. At one point during the Stockholm crisis hostage situation, one of the bank robbers was planning to shoot a hostage in the leg to make the police take his demands more seriously. The shooting never, in fact, occurred. At the time, the hostage who was to be shot thought that the robber was kind for planning only to shoot him in the leg and not to kill him. I mean, just think about how insane that is. Third, the victim is isolated from the outside world and subjected only to the captor's perspective. Fourth, the victim sees himself as unable to escape. Humor explains how each of these precursors are used by governments. Some of these, I think, are just insane. I mean, think about this. The victim is isolated from the outside world, subjected only to the captor's perspective. We mentioned before what isolation can do, and we see that as a common theme too. There's this idea of quarantines that happened not so recently, pretty recently in history. It happens as well and many times in history. Putting certain people in camps, like we talk about the Japanese internment camps, the Nazis as well. What happens when you isolate them and you only give them certain information, or even just isolate their worldview and the knowledge that they have? What does that do? Right? If our school system is based on a certain model, isolates them to a certain teaching, what is that going to do? Unable to escape. Oh, everything's hopeless. I guess we have to, vote somebody in office. I gotta do what I see is the necessary change. It's hopeless, however, to get complete freedom. So I'm just going to, enjoy the fact that there might be some benefit that comes from this person I put in office or this law that gets passed. But I'm never going to see it as a possibility that I can be completely free. Right? I'm just adding on to the justifications that people may make. But just notice the first step here is posing a credible threat to the life of the captive victim. Of course, how do we make someone a slave? How do governments form? It's usually wars, capture, right? And so usually violence is always the start of this, but then to continue the violence and to continue that wrongdoing, there has to be some sort of legitimization to that violence. There has to be some sort of deception that goes on. He says human beings can also suffer from cognitive illusions in which things appear to the mind non-perceptually otherwise than as they are. For instance, a medical procedure with an 80% success rate sounds better to most people than a procedure with a 20% failure rate. This difference has been shown to make a difference to people's practical judgments about realistic situations. And he lists a study there from 1981. One species of cognitive illusion is of particular interest to us here, that of moral illusions. These are cases in which we have a systemic tendency to see something as right or wrong when in fact it is not. Throughout history, our forebears have been subject to widespread moral illusions. For instance, that women were inferior to men, or that dark-skinned people were inferior to light-skinned ones. The suggestion that we are still subject to some moral illusions today should therefore surprise no one. And how many people, right, are talking about the ideas we're talking about here? Because there's some people who are still stuck on these past ideas, like women being equal to men and, different colors. I mean, it is rather recent. Perhaps we have recognized this, and slavery has been abolished. It's been rather recent history. The years go by rather fast. But maybe we can go even further, and we're not seeing that. Maybe we're still stuck on the past, on the progress we have already made, and we are just stuck there. We're unable to see like there might be a even bigger moral change that is beyond that. For instance, treating everybody as a human being would both work for the women scenario and the skin scenario, right? It would transcend both. It would also transcend the medical system. It would transcend the political system because everybody is simply treating each other as a human being. So can we get to that realization? If we did, it would be infinitely more powerful.
Well, think also of the moral illusions that were spread in 2020, 2021 that led to division between whether people wore a mask or took a test or got a shot, that they were somehow morally better if you do one thing versus the other. And the type of like venom that was like spewed towards those who were considered on the wrong, side.
Yeah.
You were accused of killing grandmothers,
Yeah.
sadly.
And so we can relate this idea of the Stockholm Syndrome to authoritarian mindsets. If you look up authoritarianism, somebody who definitely will come up upon your research is a psychologist, Bob Altheimer, right? And he really nails down like the different traits that you see in different followers, leaders, and the styles here. So he says that the authoritarian followers, they have submission, a high degree of submission, and they have aggression, their willingness to act aggressively in the name of these authorities. And then there's conventionalism, which is a strong adherence to societal conventions and norms. This should be rather, I'd say, common sense if you're at this point of the presentation and maybe understand what we're talking about. The leaders have dominance, and then they use manipulation. Psychological traits you'll see is conformity, and then prejudice, right? Certain outgroups, so these people are bad. Cognitive style, simplistic thinking, preference for black and white thinking and simple solutions to complex problems, and a resistance to evidence, right? Which is cognitive dissonance.
Wait, I just want to add in the difference. It seems to be, I've heard this through several individuals that I really respect, is that we're getting confused between a complex problem and a complicated problem, and that how we're contributing to certain problems to make them more complicated. So a complex problem, we can sit down rationally, intellectually, empathetically, and work through a complex problem. But when we're contributing to it being more complicated and more complicated and more complicated, we never can find a healthy solution.
And so then we can bring this to the dark triad in psychology. And you see, we're covering a lot of different aspects here that all interrelate. Here, from Delroy L. Polanus, says three interconnected negative personality traits, and he mentions that as narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. right? So narcissism is entitled self-importance, arrogance, and a need for admiration. Machiavellianism is strategic manipulation, deceit, and a focus on self-interest. And psychopathy is callousness, lack of empathy, impulsivity, and antisocial behavior. So individuals with dark triad traits, right, these three that he's identifying, often seek positions of authority, he says, to exert control and achieve personal goals. They may be effective in leadership roles due to their manipulative and strategic behaviors, but can also be exploitative and harmful. And as we've been detailing, that position of authority in government is pretty much inherently exploitative from the more we look at this. These individuals can undermine colleagues and exploit relationships for personal gain, he says. And he says that there's a lack of empathy and remorse, and it can lead to harmful and unethical decisions. So this parallels exactly what Alzheimer was saying too with authoritarianism. And if you ask yourself, would the average person want power over their fellow man? They may have great ideas of how to work society, but they're not going to necessarily say, "Oh, I want to be in office. I want to change the world and be in charge of millions of people." They don't necessarily want to do that, right? And it seems very stressful. Seems like it's not a position that human beings can really uphold for long without going a little bit insane. Right. I mean, at least that's how I would think of it too for myself. I wouldn't, even if I had all these different ideas and solutions, I wouldn't tell everybody that they had to do it. And I also would find that incredibly stressful. All these pressures, and you have to do this and do that, and it's pretty overwhelming.
It's not that experts and people that have exceptional skill don't exist in this world that we should
Right.
look up to. There are. It's just that there's a lack of self-awareness and an understanding of the dynamics that are playing out on the more deeper levels
Hmm.
and how we can get caught in these extremes,
Yes.
repeat cycles.
And here's just a chart if you want to summarize the differences between these types. Now, when you look at this chart, ask yourself, where does like statism seem to fall in here? And Machiavellianism, I feel like, is maybe the least known here on the chart. And so if you see it, it's very interesting because if you look at the fourth line on this chart, under Machiavellianism, it says violence is necessary. Whereas for psychopath, it says violence is power, narcissist is entitled to be violent, and sociopath is violence is pleasure. Now, of course, these are all wrong in their own ways, but it's very interesting, right, to say it's necessary. And how many people, if they're asked, who they vote for or their views regarding government and talking about the need for an authority figure, they'll say it's a necessary evil, right? Or I was voting for a lesser evil. It's very interesting, right?
And Corey, according to Sam Vaknin, who's a world-renowned psychologist, leading-edge psychologist, he would say that every one of these conditions now we can affirm is rooted in some sort of severe trauma.
Okay. Yeah, we see that as a common theme too. And I mean, it says too under Machiavellianism, knows he done wrong but fails to acknowledge it. Cold, calculated, and rational, right? We talked before about the left brain imbalance. And as we move into the age of science and technology, notice what it says here. It's like no display of rage, manipulative, no display of emotions, can't recognize emotional patterns. And I find that very interesting, right? Because we're talking about a lot of that. So maybe all this focus on narcissism and psychopathy, maybe there has to be some bit more focus on Machiavellianism and the whole relationship between these. And so, of course, people have other ways of saying this. We talked about like moral cognitive problems. Well, there's this term called moral injury and the bystander effect from Ashley Grogg, who says moral injury is when an individual experiences a situation that goes against their moral beliefs and causes guilt and shame. The bystander effect or bystander empathy, or sorry, bystander apathy is a social psychological theory that states that individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim in the presence of other people. Quote, when you get that punitive measure for taking that extra step and doing what's right, and you don't stand up and say, no, this is wrong, and you don't help create change, you fall into those habits and those patterns. And your moral injury just continues to grow and grow because you're not living in congruence with your beliefs. You have to decide, am I going to buck the system and risk losing everything, or am I going to sit down, shut up, and do the best I can and make changes in the little areas that I can? And that's what I hear a lot of people do. But what eventually happens is they either break and separate and give up completely, or double down on these thoughts or beliefs.
That's
Wow.
really well said and important. Yeah.
Very, I think, parallel to a lot of what we've been talking about from a different perspective. Moral injury continues to grow and grow. So, is there a contradiction? You think something is right, and then you have something that's wrong. You're not confronting the wrong, and so it's therefore not really doing what's right.
It
Talk
brings
about
us
that.
back to the playground, you know,
Hmm.
and children and how they're being, you know, shaped to sit down and don't stand up for yourself, you know,
Yep.
don't defend yourself, look to someone else to do it for you,
Hmm.
right? And that becomes a pattern that's ingrained and then can result in this. Yeah.
There's a
It's
common
clear.
quote. Sorry, I'll say
No,
the
go ahead.
quote.
Go ahead.
There's a quote from Buddha where he says like the hardest step is taking like the first step and then going all the way. And that's what this reminds me of. It's like people are unwilling to take the first step and then go all the way on it.
Mhm. Yeah, we have a major, major problem with follow through on so many, many degrees.
Hmm.
And this sentence, when you get that punitive measure for taking that extra step, really does point to how punishment is creating the fear of taking action, the fear of doing something wrong and
Yeah.
being punished.
The other end of that too is like sunk cost fallacy, which is where somebody has invested so much time and effort and resource and intellect and their life into one area that they just can't seem to question their entire reality. So they get caught. They call it sunk cost fallacy, is like,
Hmm.
I'm stuck here because I've invested my entire life, income, resources, friend group, everything within this identity. So now I'm stuck here.
Wow. Yeah. Think about how many influencers are out there that are very political, right? And create that fan base around that too. I mean, I think it's very unlikely that they're going to change their political worldviews because they built such an identity around one that they would alienate themselves from their own audience just to
Yeah.
change a simple position.
A good spiritual principle to just consider is, who are you outside of your primary identity? And
Hmm.
who would you be if your primary identity was threatened? Could you survive? Who are
Wow.
you outside of that person that you've invested so much of your identity in? And this is hugely confronting.
And
And some people say, I have no idea who I am outside of my identity. I don't even know how to find that person. I don't even know who my true self is.
may I ask you, Stephanie, what is your identity?
Well, I would first and foremost, because I take a spiritual perspective, say that I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. So that would be my first. I've also had a lot of near-death experiences and health issues, as we've talked about over this presentation, which have really shown me that we live in a material world, but from my perspective, we are spiritual beings. And to me, to have that spiritual purview amongst our material world, in essence, and even in all of my identities, comes first.
Mm.
I,
So
I
my
think you're bringing up a great point, Steph, about materialism and how most of us are so entrenched in a material worldview that is connected to our role and our
right,
survival. Yeah, that
right.
it's very frightening to think of doing anything that could threaten that material security because we have not had the time, the inclination, the encouragement, the awareness to do that deeper spiritual work that really can help us know who we are separate from and transcending any job or role that we have in life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you have not been faced or brought up in an environment to explore your spiritual nature, it becomes very complicated for people who are entrenched in matter-based jobs, realities, just very much out fighting real world issues to develop it. It takes time. That's why a lot of people, you'll see they have a spiritual awakening and they head off to Rishikesh for 5 years to find themselves. Or even somebody like what is her name? Elizabeth, I forget her last name, the author who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, right? It's like she went through several divorces, was really challenged, had an existential crisis, and then headed off to India and had these experiences to start to understand, who am I besides what I've cultivated my persona to be in the real world? Who really am I? It's this calling for something more transcendent beyond matter. And like we're all saying here, is that we are in a matter-based reality. We can't transcend up and away from it and spiritually bypass. But it is critical to understand, from my opinion, to hold the dual perspective of, let me not be specifically caught in the material realm, in my material body, because something will always come along to make you question that identity if you're really narrow in your perspective. So for people who are academic, intellectual, more left-brained oriented, sometimes it's very difficult for them to value the more broader spiritual holistic perspective. But that's, I think, what the world is calling for. It's calling for a lot of people who have held a spiritual identity or even religious identity to come back down to earth and to maybe take some action on some real world, moral, tangible issues within the world. And for the academic and the intellectual to maybe rise up in their understanding and maybe transcend beyond that which they've been strictly indoctrinated with.
You asked some really good questions too, Stephanie, and it makes me think of like, well, what is my identity? It's because like I don't hold on to those strings. Of course, we started this presentation saying that this is our title, this is that, but I think it's to meet people where they're at. I think we're kind of beyond that. That wasn't the first thing we put in the seminar, right? We've got all the other information first, then we added that at the end. We're like, well, I guess we'll include our titles to help, sympathize with people, help them understand who we are, but we're much more than that. And if you're at this point in the seminar, you realize, yeah, we're not really that attached to our labels.
Yeah, the last woo-woo thing I'll say about that is, today I participated in an event called a Death Cafe. This was started by a gentleman in London who just thought, let's get together and normalize talking about death, because everybody seems to have death anxiety and runs from death, right? So today was my first time attending a Death Cafe. And it was actually quite funny and interesting, not too many tears, not too glib. But what the presenter did say was that there's two great unifiers in the world, and that's birth and death.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, well, isn't that true? We seem to be caught in this minutia in the middle of all of this polarization and division and who's right and who's wrong. And, we forget that at some point we will all be unified again, some way, somehow.
Right. Does it all matter? Right. It's like all that division for sure. Good point. And so, along those lines, she actually shares her experience about leaving Western medicine. So it's always good to hear people's experiences, right? We share a lot of that here. And again, we encourage anybody listening as well to share their experience with us. She says, "Here I am. I've left Western medicine because it was sucking my soul out." That's how she describes it. And I thought it was just burnout, but it was moral injury. The part that really bothered me was that I was constantly putting band-aids on people's problems and we weren't doing any prevention. We were just helping them gimp along until the next time. And a lot of that pain, the guilt, the shame, the resentment, the self-loathing, it was not by other people. It came from me. It came from my own conscience grating on me. In health, we have to remember that it's our duty to share with the person the knowledge that we have, give them the best direction that we can, encourage them and empower them to seek out more information if they're not comfortable with what we're giving them. And what happens after that is under their control. I think we've gotten so lazy and comfortable and dependent on protocols and prescriptions that we forget the creativity that goes into problem solving and what it really takes to coexist. It's not just about bowing down and bending over backwards to the other person. It's about a mutual respect. It's that authenticity in relationships that forms trust. Wow, right? What a quote. How many, I mean, there's probably a lot of other people like her. I mean, you guys, I feel like, have been basically saying what she said.
Corey, I was just watching something yesterday and it was healthcare providers gently mocking, making fun of what they call frequent flyers in the emergency room.
Hmm.
People that just kind of round robin, come in, get treatment until the next time. And they said they tend to be a lot of abusers, users, people with mental health issues. But the way that these providers were talking about it is as though they've not, it's beyond apathetic. It's almost a normalization of this cycle that's playing out. I mean, any one of us here on this panel, I could imagine that if we saw the same person 3 times in a row within a short period of time, we would pull that person aside and say, tell me what is really going on? How can we help you better? And I think what happens with these providers is they want to provide certain providers want to provide other resource, want to get to the root causes of some of these issues, or at least deeper root causes, want to try to offer better solutions, but they are limited and compressed, overworked, overscheduled. The environment isn't healthy. And it's like at some point, I honestly think they lose a lot of the reason why they went into healthcare to begin with.
Fatigue, compassion fatigue, and burnout is so common in the helping field. And that emergency room example is a really good example of how that develops, because the resources are not adequate to meet the needs and the root causes aren't actually being treated.
Yeah, another example I wanted to bring up is over the whole pandemic, I had seen many social media collaborations of emergency rooms or hospital spaces all over the world where all of these providers and units were dancing, like TikTok videos, dancing here, dancing there. In some of the most grim, glib circumstances, society is somewhat in a panic, and you're seeing the providers in the hospital dancing, making TikTok videos. And it just kind of, and again, I know providers who participated in those things, and they were like, well, don't you understand? How else are we supposed to deal with all this stress and trauma? Like, they're literally in their own survival mode, almost completely disassociated from the real world. They're in so much survival, they can't see that making TikTok videos at that time in history looked really bad to the general public. It's like they were so much in a survival mode and just trying to do whatever. It's just dysfunctional because they don't have time to ever process their grief or really time to treat anybody really on a deeper level anyhow. So, and sadly, they're somewhat stuck in these situations as well too. But at some point, you gotta reclaim your soul, as Ashley was saying. It's beyond beyond moral injury. It's I can't even find my soul anymore, and that's a big
Amazing.
problem.
Wow. Yeah, that what a statement. And then it prompts us to ask, well, what is a soul? We start getting into spirituality again. It's like we tend to keep going down that route the more we go into psychology and looking at the deeper aspects. And here we have Paul Levy, a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner. And it's funny you mentioned Death Cafe. There's a Buddhist temple I go to for like Tai Chi. They do it every Wednesday to take donations only. They do it for free for the public. And so a lot of people come and they have like a garden retreat, and it's amazing stuff, what they're able to do, right? They've been there for many years and people highly respect them, and they're helping a lot of people in the area, but they also have like a death cafe thing that they do as well. And so it's amazing that, these spiritual faiths can sometimes be very healing and not necessarily get all the credit in the medical system.
Hey, Corey, real quick to add about that Death Cafe.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I met a woman who was a hospice. I believe she was a she was an RN, but she had a lot of experience as a hospice nurse. And she said she's quitting hospice nursing to become a death doula because of the freedom that has been minimized in her ability to really support the patient. So she's literally leaving her comfortable position as a hospice nurse to become a death doula just so she can simply serve the patient and the family more holistically.
Wow.
You know, it made me think about how the healthcare system is so uncomfortable with death, right? Their whole job is built around like
Survival.
and eliminating death, right? Stopping death.
Right.
And they have the least peace around a very natural part of life, right? Which is the end of our lives, right? And so this spiritual aspect is being absent from the healthcare field, leaves, I think, people in it like without the tools to properly understand death and how and as a part of life, as a natural part of life, and then to be able to offer full support emotionally to the patients, right? Death becomes the enemy.
Yeah, we were talking about this in the Death Cafe today as well, and I was bringing up a time when I was in a relationship with a healthcare provider who often would call himself a firefighter. And we were talking in the Death Cafe and really honoring the fact that some medical providers, literally that is somewhat their job, is they are in a firefighter, fight or flight survival mode themselves to save lives in very serious traumatic situations that come in. That is their role, and that is an important aspect of healthcare, is to be in that warrior mentality to, we got to, try to save a life, as that song, stay up to save a life, that one song that was popular like in the 2000s. But the other end of it is the aspect of surrender. And I made a little joke in the group. I said, it's funny because this guy I was with, he was all about the fight and I was all about the surrender. And could we understand that both of them were 100% needed and needed to be in a relationship? And I think that's the thing, is that we have this survival, which is important in fighting death, but we don't have enough of the appreciation of the death experience and the surrendering too. The hospice nurse was saying, you die like you live. And if you don't find a level of peace and surrender within yourself in this world, your death process is usually very uncomfortable and very difficult for your family members. So she said it's very important to find and appreciate the elements of when to be a warrior and when to fight, but to acknowledge like the masculine energy, but to acknowledge the Eastern, the feminine, the aspects of complete surrender in the moment to what is, and an honoring of the transformation and death and rebirth process that there is. So the issue is, you hear people talk about the healthcare system, that it's a death culture. And it's strange because they would say, what do you mean it's a death culture? We're just fighting for everybody to be alive. It's just, we don't have the conscious awareness around it, that there is death. We need to understand and be able to talk about death without extreme of either, we don't want to proselytize death and have people in other countries having assisted suicide at 30 because they're just stressed out. That's not healthy. That's way imbalanced. But yet we don't want to go into the aspects of tech so far out where we're fighting death and nobody wants to die and I want to live to 150. That's ridiculous too. It becomes ridiculous on both sides when we're out of balance. So how do we fight for life and life affirmation, but also be able to equally honor and appreciate the surrendering of the death process?
Yeah. And I'll just add that the fear of death sets one up for being manipulated. And we saw that during the 2020 events, that people are naturally desiring to live and survive. However, if one hasn't the spiritual base to find some level of acceptance in the cycles of life, death, rebirth, and so on, then one can be emotionally exploited to do things that can lead to the problems we've been addressing today.
That's why this
So true.
What, Scott?
So true and so well stated. Yeah.
That's why the spiritualization arc is being attacked voraciously. Because once you have an individual understand or feeling comfortable in their true self and understanding the surrender to the life and death process, and we move out of the fear, things change, the system changes.
Yeah.
So we have to be cognizant that we actually should be moving into a spiritualization arc and helping people to understand their life beyond just their identity. And because that will open up things for a broader change. But we're in this process of people doubling down, as you were saying, Leslie, doubling down on the way thing was, because nobody wants their identity or their ego challenged and threatened to the degree, especially when somebody's already exhausted. You take a nurse or somebody that's been working in healthcare who's already fried, and then you say, okay, we're going to add an ego death on top of this now for you. How do you like that? It's difficult.
And then add again, the legal threat to individuals, to have lawsuits for negligence or making a mistake. I think that, the insurance rates are really high in the health field because of that. And so that, I think that adds to this dynamic.
It's keeping a lot of providers stuck in matter, not able to see too much of what's ahead of them.
Yeah. Commonly said within a Tao Te Ching, like if you don't fear death, you basically become immortal. It's like you live forever because there is no concept there it's holding you back. So it's a very, very deeply psychological for sure. So talking about the psychology in relation to the spirituality, here we have a good example, talking about Wetiko and conscience, a contagious psycho-spiritual disease, which we can also talk about, what we talked about before, mass psychosis, termed Wetiko, manifest as a collective psychosis affecting humanity. This mind virus operates through unconscious blind spots, leading individuals to act against their best interests, creating a sickness of the spirit. The normalization of collective madness makes it difficult for individuals to recognize the psychosis. Many fail to see the signs of Wetiko, mistakenly believing that it would manifest in overtly chaotic behaviors. Right, so there's a deception behind it. It's more covert, less overt. Wetiko embodies insatiable greed and exploitation, consuming resources without reciprocity. It distorts perceptions, leading individuals to see their own pathologies in others, fostering polarization and fear. The roots of Wetiko lie within the human psyche, reflecting our inner conflicts. The disease thrives on our disconnection from true self and agency, making us susceptible to manipulation. Recognizing Wetiko's influence can lead to empowerment and healing. The epidemic serves as a catalyst for evolution, urging humanity to awaken to its intrinsic creative power and interconnectedness. Compassion emerges as a key antidote to Wetiko, fostering awareness of the dreamlike nature of reality and promoting unity and healing within the collective consciousness. Right, of course, Carl Jung talks about this collective unconsciousness, so it relates here, talking about psychosis, and on a mass scale, seeing how does that manifest, right? So here's just another way of looking at it.
Paul's work is very interesting. I would recommend people to check out that book.
Great. And Stephanie, I want you to actually, expand on, we've been talking about science versus like spirit or matter, and talking about the left brain versus the feminine and the right brain. Well, what if there is great science out there? What if we can conduct our science even better than the way we're doing things right now? So that way we do have a balanced, left brain, right brain approach to science. Well, I know that you're familiar with Eric Weinstein. If you want to expand on this and read the slide for us.
Sure. All right. So we've got good science, which is careful, modest, statistically rigorous. Great science often borders on irresponsibility, crosses adaptive valleys. It isn't just good science turned up to 11. It may involve saying wrong things before they're right. It can include creativity, bravery, and unconventional methods. It is difficult to teach rules for great science, and the current scientific environment may stifle great discoveries. We need to embrace elitism based on ability not background, allow eccentricities in truly extraordinary minds, foster environments for Hail Mary attempts in science, communicate science power and frustrations honestly.
And you're familiar with I think it's brothers, right? The Weinstein brothers, or
Yeah, Brett Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heying have a really great podcast called the Dark Horse Podcast, which I think started right when the pandemic started at 2021. And they're pariahs in their own field as educators with I forget the name of the college, but they both were fired from their universities as evolutionary biologists. Evergreen University in Oregon, I believe it is. And they were caught up in a really crazy kind of Black Lives Matter dilemma. And they're extraordinary evolutionary biologists. Their story is very interesting, but because they were extradited from their field, they started the Dark Horse podcast. And Brett is brothers with Eric, who's a PhD mathematician, brilliant mind. So, but both have really great points and aren't afraid to challenge their own field.
wow, great. Good to hear. And so it takes courage, right? We talked about this. Let's dive a little bit into it. From the Academy of Ideas, there's an increasing acceptance of authoritarianism due to individual powerlessness and anxiety, leading to the recent acceleration towards totalitarian rule in some Western countries. The lack of courage is the primary enabler of this trend. Factors contributing to conformity include emphasis on social validation, social media dynamics, education system, promoting majority rights over individual rights. Again, we talked about collectivism and tribalism. That's basically what that's talking about. It says these factors manifest as blind obedience to rules, failure to differentiate between morality and legality, and desire to enforce conformity on others. The dangers include potential for a continuum of destruction, and that what's mentioned there is the work of Erwin Staub, which I think we're going to be going into soon as well. Historical examples of gradual progression toward mass persecution. And so we must have a willingness to face risks, to stand up for truth, freedom, and justice. A very good video if you'd like to go into like the idea of courage and why that's been on the decline recently and why people are willing to be obedient. This is basically a summary of what the video details. Some channels out there like Academy of Ideas and After School have been detailing the psychology that we're sharing here in different ways and different videos being put out. We're bringing a lot of that together here, and then we're looking at the deeper aspect of statism, which unfortunately I have not seen among these different channels and their work. So great to see, and good to see these underpinning psychologies, but even better is to see beyond it to even greater extents.
Hey, Corey, real quick, just something very simple on the physiological hormonal aspect of things is cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which is needed sometimes, but we've discovered that a lot of us are living in these low or high levels of chronic elevated cortisol levels. When cortisol levels are high for a masculine, his testosterone goes down, which can create passivity, right, over time. And then for a female, when her cortisol is constantly triggered, her oxytocin goes down. So it elevated stress and everything we have going on that's being projected at us from the media, politics, all of these issues, the chronic stress is affecting us on a biological, physiological, hormonal level. So that's another thing we need to be aware of, and another reason why exploring the spiritualization arc can be helpful. Just to implement something like meditation or some sort of stress relief practice into people's lives can help them to hopefully deflect some of this excess cortisol that may be changing their body chemistry.
Yes. So that way we're not stuck in this continuum, it says, of destruction and this progression toward mass persecution, which we see in history. We must be willing to stand up for truth. We see, the spiritual practices can definitely bolster up the courage in individuals and help them see, like, this is what I can do. And that maybe, God's going to assist me, right? Like Carl Jung said, having that higher force to assist you is like so paramount. He saw in his view to fight against the state and its power.
And I don't know what our viewers are thinking about if they're, questioning what we're referring to when we talk about spirituality. What we're referring to is really garnering the inner resource and courage necessary to do what's good and true. So think about Bruce Lee. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating because you can pretty much see it under every spiritual perspective, no matter what religion you come from, that sense of doing what is right, right? And trying to uphold that beyond the man-made systems, right? So I think we can all perhaps agree there. And I know that, again, within religious texts, there are sometimes justifications that people have dissected for these systems that we have created. But can we understand the psychology and the statism to recognize maybe that's not necessarily the case? And we actually see some of the religious figures throughout history being the most persecuted by the governments, being hung and all sorts of things.
It's always faith and works, right? Truth and goodness. It's always this relationship of the inner and the outer, right? And that's what we need right now. We need people in the right mind who have solutions to take action and to stand up, right? But you have to also have the discernment or the goodness within to be able to know that you're standing up for the right principle. I've had a lot of very smart people over the last couple of years say to me, I don't know what truth is anymore. And in my opinion, it's because there's a disconnect from their spiritual higher self. When you are truly connected to your spiritual higher self, you understand discernment and you know the truth, right? So when you know the truth, you can act in goodness then, right? So that's where we're at. If you don't know the truth, it's time for you to go within to find the discernment and get in touch with your soul again to find the truth so you act appropriately. What we have now are people acting and making rules and regulations within our world who are disconnected from their soul and spirit, from the innate goodness of the interconnection of all that is in the world and all of us together. That's a bad place. We don't want to be in that world.
Yeah. We all need to ask ourselves, who are we beyond the physical? Who am I beyond this material world? And how do I connect my physical being with something spiritual, something that is immaterial?
It's it's a relationship. And I think, again, if everybody can just understand, I had a friend who was a very smart PhD. At one point, we were doing some spiritual work, and he said, I feel like I'm in an abyss. I don't know where I am. I feel completely overwhelmed. I'm afraid. It's like he was going within to his internal feelings that maybe he had not addressed his whole entire life. And he was starting to feel very overwhelmed, which for men is complicated, and overconsumed. But that is part of the process. Is there may be some fear as you go into these deeper feelings that you maybe have been avoiding, but the goal is you will be able to orient yourself. And then the goal is the healthy relationship between your inner being and the physical world. It's not that one's going to swallow up or eat up the other one. It's that you've been too much energy in one aspect of yourself and avoiding the other. That's just like, let's say somebody like Ramana Maharshi or some of the spiritual gurus or yogis from the past who live in caves, who are completely spiritual masters, but don't eat. And their bodies are like they literally have no physical strength at all because they've neglected their physical at the behest of enhancing their spiritual. So I think right now is everybody has to look in the mirror and say, where do I lie on the spectrum? Am I a materialist? Have I been avoiding my inner self, or have I been focusing so much on my inner self that now I need to have the courage to go back out and apply what I've learned?
Good points. Thank you, Stephanie.
Sure.
And there's an acceptance of authority we see. Again, this is another psychologist, Rollo May. Authoritarianism in religion and science, let alone politics, is becoming increasingly accepted, not particularly because so many people explicitly believe in it, but because they feel themselves individually powerless and anxious. I mean, he just gave an example too. So what else can one do except follow the mass political leader or follow the authority of customs, public opinion, and social expectations? The opposite to courage in our particular age is automation conformity. I don't know if that's a coincidence, the fact that automation is increasing simultaneously, but we are becoming much like the tools that we have created, right? And we're becoming increasingly dependent on those tools, perhaps becoming more like them because of it. But our particular problem in the present day is an overwhelming tendency toward conformity. In such times, ethics tend more and more to be identified with obedience. One is good to the extent that one obeys the dictates of society. It is as though the more unquestioning obedience, the better. But what really is ethical about obedience? If one's goal were simple obedience, one could train a dog to fulfill the requirements very well. So we're much more than dogs, and this is why we're trying to reach that point of view. I mean, I've seen this too, right? This idea of social Darwinism, like, oh, the bees have a monarch, they have a queen, right, that they obey. So we humans must be like the bees and have a queen that and king that we must obey. But clearly here in America, we challenged the monarchy. We said the king and queen don't have that right, and they don't not that special. Well, if we continue that path, we're not like the bees anymore, are we? We may still have hierarchies and people that we look up to voluntarily, but we're not necessarily giving someone the right to rule over us and saying they are more special than us. And, I can't speak for the bees. Maybe they don't, maybe they actually are voluntarily following, right? But I think it's interesting that many people make these comparisons as justifications to control others. And he says the hallmark of courage in our age of conformity is the capacity to stand on one's own convictions, to stand on your own conscience, right? Like we said before. And so valuing social conformity, here we have Irvin Staub, as I mentioned before, and then Stanley Feldman, who's a professor. He says people who value social conformity support the government when it wants to increase its control over social behavior and punish nonconformity. Valuing social conformity increases the motivation for placing restrictions on behavior. The desire for social freedom is now subservient to the enforcement of social norms and rules. Thus, groups will be targeted for repression to the extent that they challenge social conformity. One psychological consequence of harm doing is further de-evaluation of victims. People tend to assume that victims have earned their suffering by their actions or character. How does harmful behavior become the norm? Doing harm to a good person or passively witnessing it is inconsistent with a feeling of responsibility for the welfare of others and the belief in a just world. Inconsistency troubles us. We minimize it by reducing our concern for the welfare of those we harm or allow to suffer. We devalue them, justify their suffering by their evil nature or by higher ideals. And this is where we can see, the flip side of religion, where someone says, you believe different from me, you inherently are evil, right? So the flip side of the spirituality that we're talking about. And so he says a challenged view of the victims, changed attitude toward that suffering, and changed self-concept result. So really summarizing a lot of what we've been talking about, but emphasizing this devaluation of victims, which again is far from authenticity, where people are just treating each other as fellow equals and instead, putting other people down or up in different ways. And so the psychology of totalitarianism, we talk about authoritarianism, these tend to relate, and you'll come across the works of Matthias Desmet, a psychologist who says mass formation. Another word for mass psychosis, it's a type of collective hypnosis where individuals lose their ethical self-awareness and critical thinking abilities. He mentions that there's actually a corruption of science. He argues that scientific research has been compromised by errors, biases, and even fraud, leading to a distorted reality. And then he mentions a mechanistic ideology. So, right, he's covering it all. You notice he's not just talking about conformity and authority. He's talking about like these underlying things that we've been talking about. He says there's a hidden ideology that governs our lives, contributing to social isolation, mental suffering, and a lack of meaning. That's the mechanism. And so Desmet links the rise of totalitarian regimes to societal conditions like loneliness, free-floating anxiety, and a consistent crisis narrative that exploits these feelings. And to me, this sounds like a collective trauma that we've been detailing. Notice that loneliness goes in line with what we talked about before with isolation and quarantine.
I think that in today's world, if you don't mind going back to that
Hmm.
slide, it reminds me of the politics going on right now, post-election, that there's been this extreme division among people, and then one political outcome is leading to these real rise of free-floating anxiety and a real crisis narrative that is fueling, you know, this situation where, according to this, will likely lead to more government control, more totalitarianism as a solution, perhaps.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think we've seen that over the last three elections, really,
Mm.
where there was significant dysregulation on one of the sides, more so than I can remember in the past. And it just seems to be escalating post-election.
Yeah. He continues here. He says the main factors that link the two, which, he calls technocracy and totalitarianism. So technocracy would be that mechanistic ideology he's referring to. He says is the belief that human intellect can guide society, aims to create a utopian society led by experts, subordinates individuals to the collective, manifested, he said, in Nazism and Stalinism historically, and presents as an undercurrent in modern society, appeals through promise of artificial paradise, imposes control based on anxiety and necessity, pushes for technological solutions and control, presents itself as pinnacle of rationality and science, ignores human need for privacy and autonomy, fails to account for complex or interconnected nature of reality, contrast with mystical views of science's founders, and the alternative is accepting uncertainty, fostering creativity and individuality. So right there, he's giving us the problem and the solution. I find this to be disturbing, considering the fact that I do see a lot of this in our modern world. And again, we see this word utopia being thrown around in the sense that it's not used as an attack against those people that we call anarchists. We talked about that term before, but in the sense is actually the opposite. That the utopian individual is the statist, the person who wants a certain set structure over everybody and says this is what the individual should be subjected to. I find that to be quite interesting, right? Because usually it's always thrown on the other end. Oh, you're utopian if you want to be free from those systems. And it's exactly the way Carl Jung wrote this. He said artificial paradise, he said utopian, very much in line with what Jung was referring to here. Same thing with the rationality and the scientific point of view. That's very left brain, as we mentioned. It's I don't know if it's a coincidence that we're seeing all these parallels with these researchers, but we are going to come across other researchers who may disagree with each other. I just want to put that out there. Like there is some nuance, some things that we're going to go over of different ways to look at it, right? But it's still interesting to see the parallels nonetheless. And the dislocation of power. This is Saul Newman, and he's part of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Newman argues that power is not centralized, but spread throughout society, right? So this is a different way of looking at power. This is a good example of what I meant, like by different perspectives. So everyday interactions, social norms, and various institutions, not just laws or government. That is what he refers to as power, and it influences various aspects of life, including individual psychology. Lacanian psychoanalysis suggests that our identities are constructed through language and power relations. Understanding this can help therapists address issues related to identity and self-perception. By uncovering the unconscious mechanisms of power, which is fears and desires, therapists can help individuals recognize and challenge the internalized norms and beliefs that may be contributing to their psychological distress. Now, this idea of internalization is very common that you'll see throughout this presentation. This perspective can empower clients by helping them see how their personal struggles are connected to broader social and political structures, fostering a sense of agency and potential for change. Again, I would say this is an emphasis on the individual seeing their role within that grand society, right? and seeing how they don't have to be a part of those identities, those norms, not just the laws and the government, because these all we see tend to relate with one another, which is why people make justifications for government using social norms and other institutions as their reasoning. Right, just as we mentioned before, George Fitzhugh, who was a leading pro-slavery advocate, was using government as actually an excuse to keep slavery by saying that they're basically one and the same. So he's using one form of institution to support another. And we see these justifications, like we said before, like, oh, a politician does good, so to justify their position of authority. But these are separate things, not necessarily the same thing. So, of course, in the case of Fitzhugh, he's saying government and slavery are the same thing. So, very interesting if you're able to decipher through this. But we'll talk more about Lacanian psychoanalysis. Here's some insights from Duane Roussel, who says melancholia is not just a psychological condition, but a profound realization that one never truly existed in the world as it is. This sense of non-existence fuels a desire for radical change as revolutionaries seek to create a world where they can truly exist. Drawing from Lacanian psychoanalysis, melancholia is seen as a state of subjective destitution, which paradoxically empowers individuals to challenge and transform existing social structures. True revolutionary change requires confronting and embracing the chaotic, unstructured aspects of reality, breaking free from conventional structures. And when I read this, I think of Taoism. Like that comes to mind much greatly, because there's a lot of concepts in that philosophy that, again, and it's credited as being like one of the first like freedom-oriented texts in history. It's often credited with this idea of trusting the universe and accepting reality as it is with all its chaos within. Because by going against that acceptance of that chaos, you actually create more chaos. And that is basically the perspective that's being shared here. It's like, what if you can accept the fact that you don't necessarily, have everything in place in a perfect structure and the world is perfectly the way you want it to be? And accepting that fact that you don't belong with other people can be a spark for radical change, becoming a revolutionary, right? Whether, that's good or bad revolutionary, that's another scenario, but nonetheless a revolutionary, somebody who's inspired to act. And
it brings us back,
yeah,
Court, to the conclusion that the answer lies in doing internal work. It comes back to facing our fears and not letting our fears rule us in terms of our social behaviors. Yeah.
yes,
And
I
our
think
spiritual nature as well, developing that.
something to be aware of, I also notice is like we're talking about melancholia. The word melancholy comes to mind too. It's like defeatism, escapism. We want to be careful of the isolation we talked about before, right? Like if you feel like you're not a part of society, you can use that to gather courage to act or to put yourself down. And, it's really your choice of how you want to move forward with that worldview of saying, wait, I think different from other people, or I'm in a different position.
There's a framework that I've heard from our good friend Scott, who's here on the call. He talks about reach and withdraw. And the idea, again, of just introducing a framework for people to understand that part of life involves both of these aspects of going within, reorganizing, having the ability to surrender what is, reorient yourself, learn, grow, evolve, and then to go back out into the world and to like your own scientific experiment, demonstrate that which you've learned. And it's this constant flow, like nature, this process that we're in, so just to have that awareness, I think helps people to I don't know, it just seems like we wouldn't be living life so blindly and like a victim to our realities, right? That we would have a understanding we have a little control and also we don't. It's both. Always
Right.
simultaneously. It's a dance.
Hmm. Yes. very paradoxical to this worldview. And Lacanian psychoanalysis not as well known as Jung and his works, right? We talk about Jungian type of psychology. So definitely, if you're not interested, I mean, haven't like really heard of it, definitely might want to look into it as a field of interest. So now the mass psychology of fascism, right? We talked about authoritarianism, totalitarianism. Well, I mean, you can go through all these different isms and ologies, but essentially understanding what are the concepts, right? What are the ideas? You'll come across the works of Wilhelm Reich, who influenced a lot of individuals, and he was a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist. His book was burned by Nazis. It also expelled him from the International Psychoanalytical Association, got him kicked out of communist parties in the Soviet Union, and also had all his books burned from the FDA in the USA. So this guy was incredibly controversial back in his day, and worked on numerous different things related to geoengineering, like weather control, in a way to counter other weather control. And he also worked on other things like fields of interest like bioenergetics and muscular armor is what he called it. And so there's a lot of other psychologists and people who've taken off of his work and expanded on it greatly. So he had some pretty controversial findings in some of his works, particularly this one. He says sexual repression and symbolism fuels authoritarian ideologies. Strict family structure reinforces authoritarian attitudes. Authoritarianism exploits irrational fears and desires in masses. Authoritarianism is linked to rigid personality structures. Economic and sexual frustration breed authoritarian tendencies. Authoritarianism offers illusory sense of power to the powerless. And mysticism and nationalism is used to manipulate emotions. Right. So when this guy was alive doing a lot of what he was doing, there was a lot of very national governments at the time, promoting this like sort of populist type of message, you can call it. And something to just bear in mind is like what is really being played on in the populace? Because of course it's still statism, whether it's this ism or that ology, it's communism or Nazism, it's still statism. So what is going on that's exploiting people's fears when he's saying it's actually sexual repression? Okay. And so he says he urges the little man to recognize his own power and potential. Reich believes that by understanding and overcoming their internalized oppression, individuals can reclaim their autonomy. He also details the concept of character armor, which refers to the defensive mechanisms people develop to cope with emotional pain and societal pressures, which can lead to authoritarianism. The millenary subjugation of impulsive life created the ground for the psychological fear of the masses to the authority and the submission to it, for an incredible humility on one side and a sadistic brutality on the other side. Right? Master and slave dynamic, dominator and victim dynamic, and how that becomes further polarized.
I wanted to say that I've always found Reich extremely fascinating in that he found the connection between the spirit and the body and that interface and what goes on in the body, not just in illness, but in things like tension, and what he calls character armor comes from the shape of the emotional body and its influence on the actual shape of the body and its muscular structure. It's extremely fascinating. And he was a brilliant researcher, and as it points out, he was attacked. And, I think a lot of his research may hold some of the missing links that various disciplines have ignored or haven't been able to connect themselves, because he's pretty much banned from the mainstream to this day. You don't get a lot of unless you have a breakaway professor, a rogue professor that will go over this. So it's worth looking into.
Yeah, and don't worry, we'll certainly go more into it. so people can know more about his work because many others have expanded on it. So we're concluding here with some final slides here. The idea of repressive desublimation by Herbert Marcuse, a sociologist, who says authoritarian systems allow certain forms of pleasure or self-expression, but in a way that ultimately reinforces their power. Right? So this idea of pleasure, self-expression, and the sexuality, these deeper ideas that sometimes appear in psychology can relate to what we're talking about with authoritarianism. This controlled release acts as a safety valve, preventing more substantial forms of dissent. While people may feel that they have various freedoms, like consumer choices and sexual liberation, these often distract from more meaningful political and economic freedoms that remain restricted. The abundance of consumer goods and entertainment options keep the population distracted and content, reducing the likelihood of questioning the system or engaging in political activism. By providing outlets for desires and frustrations, the system reduces the buildup of tension that might otherwise lead to rebellion. People feel less need to challenge authority when their immediate desires are somewhat satisfied. The constant pursuit of pleasure and consumption leaves little time or energy for deeper reflection on societal issues. This intellectual apathy benefits authoritarian systems by creating a more docile population. The illusion of freedom created by repressive desublimation helps maintain the existing power structure. People are less likely to demand change when they believe they already enjoy significant freedoms. Right? So this is the goal of all the arts and the theater and the rituals, perhaps.
I think this speaks a lot about the manifestation of authority and bullying
Mm.
in society. And he's talking about the how that manifests in people's behavior and the outlets that they seek to relieve the tension. People who can't fight back are going to suffer internalization, and that's going to manifest as tension. And those tensions are going to be they're pursued in many different ways, and this slide is a great example of that. So it's definitely a good observation on his
Yes.
part as to how society responds to that. But we can trace it back to authority and bullying.
I know there's definitely a lot of talk online about sexuality and this race and that and this gender and constantly wars between that and people not looking at the bigger, more thoughtful picture of what's going on here, right? We're fighting each other, not necessarily the people who are in power or ourselves, right?
If they can keep us circulating in surface level traumas and issues and isms,
Hmm.
keeps us from going deeper or broader, as you say, to move beyond those unconscious relief tactics that maybe Scott was talking about, that where, capitalism in its essence, the way it lives now is what, you know, those are the ones who capitalize off of our dysfunction by finding that relief, whether it be working our butt off, for the man, and then going to the bar on Friday night and dropping money at the local bar to get drunk. It's just, we're caught in this unconscious loop where we have so much more potential than this. If we can bring awareness to the ways in which we seek relief. Why do we seek relief? Go upstream. Are we imbalanced in other areas of our life? What are we actually doing? How are we actually living our life?
Yes.
Yeah, think of all the hacks and quick fixes and fast foods and simplifications in our lifestyle today, the convenience culture, which is not indicating a healthy lifestyle per se, but a desire to get relief from the grind,
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
people are pretty much forced into.
It's
Really.
almost do more with less consciousness.
Yeah.
Not everybody is doing that. There are people who are understanding how to wield this and operate differently. But again, you have to really be of sound mind and discernment to not get trapped in everything that's coming at us, from my belief.
Yeah. Herbert actually shares with us the solution calls it the Great Refusal. That's what he calls the solution to this. And he says it's collective memory and disobedience that can lead to societal change. So that means remembering past struggles and injustices, right? We gave a lot of examples of the past and history to know what can happen to us and what has happened rather recently. So, he says this great refusal is a rejection of the existing social order in favor of a more humane and liberated society. This is to take place with the help, he says, of imagination, right? Not necessarily imagination as in not in touch with reality, but imagination as in like a better future, right? Which you may say is like the goal of this idea of utopia, as Oscar Wilde or Alan Watts has said, is like the aim of society, utopia in a good sense. But he says imagination fantasy itself retains the truth of the great refusal, or positively, the truth of the alternative, right? Imagination envisions the reconciliation of the individual with the whole, of desire with realization, of happiness with reason. Sounds to me again kind of like masculine and feminine and bringing things back into a balance because that right brain is more of the imaginative side. He says the outsiders or the underprivileged are catalysts for this. Okay, so they're the ones that are really going to spark the change here.
Yes,
And
the artists. It's a call
yes,
for cultivating our creativity and
right.
thinking outside the box and being open to those people who do that.
That's why we
It's
created this.
it's an exceptional feat for the starving artist to overcome the ways in which they've boxed themselves in, protecting themselves from a perceivably unhealthy world. So it's a lot of empowerment that goes into getting the artist to be a functional member of society in a healthy way where they can embody the principles to live and thrive. Because again, it's that balance. It's if you're incredibly gifted creatively, very often you have to work on some basic principles, foundational principles to be able to live and thrive in a material world. So again, it's really assessing who are you and where are you at and what can you do to almost embody your opposite. And I think very often what we do is we condemn our opposite. We hate our opposite. We don't want it. We don't want to honor the opposite within us, that shadow within us. But if you can find a way to embrace that, then you have a wonderfully creative genius as an artist who's able to interact with the real world and market themselves and sell their product and make a living doing so. So it's like life requires a little bit of a multitude of skills. And I think very often we fall into our proclivities and then shame somehow and the opposite side where we really need work in.
Yes,
Yeah. If
absolutely.
if in our daily life our creative qualities are oppressed, and that we are stuck in left brain or we're constantly in the grind of work, then we sublimate those drives to create by doing the hacks and those incomplete activities, right? They're not fully satisfying. They're not getting to the root of what we really need, but they give us a quick fix. The addictions,
Sure.
you know. Uh, so
Yeah.
Leslie, there's something within the creative process itself that releases, it creates some sort of space for freedom and transformation. So when we outsource our creativity to be more productive, we're missing out on the process. So it's not necessarily about using creativity to be more productive, but there's actually something happening within the creative process that's deeply freeing us and getting us back in touch with our deeper aspects, our soul.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely, I must say, your camera is like a spiritual environment right now. It looks like you're
I'm
glowing.
losing light.
But yeah, so I mean these guys, I mean they're calling for a moral outrage, as Barrington Moore says, and like I said, we're concluding here, so it's good to leave you guys off on some sort of sense of urgency of action. I think you guys can, if you resonate so far, that's great. And if you don't, let us know, where how you're feeling right now, and where you are currently at with your emotions in regards to this information, right? Are you getting emotionally charged? Are you feeling like, oh man, I just, this doesn't seem right. I don't know what to do in my profession. Do I leave? Do I speak up? This is the project for you. This is why we created this. So Moore argues that a sense of moral indignation rather than mere material deprivation often drives people to rebel against perceived injustices. So not just saying I'm not going to be attached to this material thing, but having a moral duty. And this again relates to Carl Jung when he said like having that higher power makes you way more powerful. People often tolerate authority based on an unspoken agreement that rulers will provide certain benefits or protections, and this is an implicit social contract. When this perceived contract is broken, it can lead to unrest. People internalize and rationalize hierarchical structures, often through cultural norms, tradition, or belief systems. Collective hardships can create a strong sense of community and shared identity, which can be a powerful force in social movements. People's ideas about what's just or unjust are shaped by cultural and historical context, influencing their responses to social conditions. Individuals often develop psychological mechanisms to rationalize or accept unfair social structures, especially if they benefit from them. Rapid shifts in social or economic circumstances can disrupt people's sense of normalcy and expectations, potentially leading to unrest. People are more likely to revolt when they believe better alternatives exist and are achievable, highlighting the role of imagination in social change. There we see it again. He says, quote, "The kings new and old abide by no contract with their subjects. They kill their own subjects, each other's subjects, and on occasion, each other. And they all do it in the name of a public interest, a welfare, about which there is no agreement, and which threatens to turn into a nightmare." What a quote. Basically detailing statism in a nutshell. Turns everybody against each other, turns everybody no longer honest, humane, and authentic.
In the guise of doing good.
Exactly. And so, justifying ideology, he says that too. In highly stratified societies, ruling classes may develop a mindset that dehumanizes lower classes, making it easier to justify violence against them. Systems of privilege can create psychological distress, psychological defenses and beneficiaries, leading them to rationalize or ignore systemic violence. The experience of arbitrary power can create a psychology of fear and compliance. Rapid social change can lead to a sense of anomie or normlessness, potentially lowering psychological barriers to violence. And ideologies that emphasize purity, whether racial, political, or religious, can psychologically prepare people to accept or participate in violence against impure elements. Right? It's like maybe people are actually seeking a moral purity, but instead this is the avenue of which they go, right? Because it's being presented to them by the different rulers and the people who are seeking to control others. They'll maybe even use, we talked about religion as a means to control people when in fact it can be used to help free people, right? So it's really the people and the victim and their choice of what to do. Let's empower the patients, empower the citizen. And here, to conclude, we have Otto Gross, who is somebody that was called a twin brother by Carl Jung, and he was an early disciple of Sigmund Freud. And he was a psychoanalyst and actually called himself an anarchist. So very unique here. Gross believed that societal norms and repression were the root causes of mental illness, a stance that puts him at odds with more conservative figures in the field. This professional isolation meant that Ross never, he had fewer opportunities for collaboration, funding, and recognition, which significantly impacted his financial stability. He stated, quote, "The inestimable future of psychoanalysis as the very soul of tomorrow's revolutionary movement." So he believes, psychology and psychoanalysis is what's going to cause like the revolution of the future. And he believed that whoever wants to change the structures of power and production in a repressive society has to start by changing these structures in himself and to eradicate the authority that has infiltrated one's own inner being. Right. So again, is that statism? I mean, it sounds to me a lot like it because, of course, this is a belief system that people have. It's not putting the emphasis on the rulers or what's external to us. It's putting the emphasis on what do we have within ourselves. So he saw the unconscious mind harbors repressed values and potentials, and these are often suppressed by authoritarian structures and education. Repressed values, when brought to consciousness, can challenge and subvert established norms. This process can lead to revolutionary thinking and actions. So, much like Jung, his work is very detailed, not necessarily the easiest to read. I've guided some of his texts, but definitely very insightful, very unique, and very controversial, which means I'm going to look into it. But these findings are incredible. Right. So just like Reich, inspired a lot of individuals. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for part 4 here. And like I said, if you resonate with this information, I hope you are starting to resonate. Thank you so much, for joining us, hearing all our experiences. We want to hear from you and your experience and how you can help us in this whole process. And like I said, if you don't resonate and you feel like you maybe don't have an experience to share or anything, that's okay too. Right? We want you to be a part of this and to share your observations and what you see is going on, maybe as a patient, whether as a client or as a coach or as a doctor, whoever you may be. So thank you very much for joining us. Go to healthrevealed.org. Thank you. Join us for part 5. Take care.
The infamous Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "Show me a man who is not a slave. One is a slave to lust, another to greed, another to ambition, and all men are slaves to fear." All humans subject themselves to mental enslavement. Historical conquerors, politicians, the CEOs of today, your bosses, all of them rule over many, many people, yet fail to rule their own minds. The most recognizable Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, wrote in Meditations, "Alexander and Caesar and Pompey, compared with Diogenes, Heraclitus, Socrates, the philosophers knew the what, the why, the how. Their minds were their own. The others? Nothing but anxiety and enslavement." Stoic philosophers look to teach us to think beyond our emotional instability, free us from mental enslavement, free us from the turbulence of our emotions. Aurelius himself faced his own mental demons. Stop allowing your mind to be a slave, to be jerked about by selfish impulses, to kick against fate and the present, and to mistrust the future. How do we overcome mental enslavement? Stoic philosophers hold the keys to understanding a mindset and way of thinking that can be extremely applicable to living a good life, a productive life. The idea of inserting personal responsibility into your personal philosophy. We often want to blame others for our state of mind, our job, our wealth, not having the same privileges as others. But do privilege and wealth truly help you escape mental enslavement? Just look at Hollywood. Look at all of the stories of dysfunctional behaviour in Hollywood, where a star is one bad decision away from being shipped off to Crazy Town. Money and fame cannot buy you mental freedom. We all suffer setbacks in life, events out of our control, losing loved ones, facing financial ruin at the hands of others, rejection and heartbreak, putting endless effort into a project only to be left crushed when it fails. Every single one of us forms our own unique identity, the story of you. Fate leads the willing and drags along the reluctant. Life moves on a linear line, like a movie. You can choose to be an actor or choose to be the director. Allowing those conquerors, bosses, politicians, and CEOs to have more power over us and our own happiness than we do is to be stuck in our own victimhood. By believing other people and circumstances control how we think, feel, and dictate the choices we make is to live in mental enslavement. Overcoming this mindset, freeing yourself from victimhood, can only be done by embracing a philosophy of personal responsibility for your own choices. We cannot allow ourselves to take pride in casting ourselves as the victim, only to regard others as victimizers, taking joy in our misery. wearing our misfortunes as a badge of honour, justifying our own self-pity. In reality, it allows us to wallow in our own mental shortcomings. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. The world owes us nothing. Believing others are advantaged where you are disadvantaged does nothing to change your circumstances. There is no knight in shining armour coming to rescue you from your own mindset of victimhood. When we embrace the mindset of victimhood, deflecting our personal responsibility, just remember there are many politicians and bosses at the ready to exploit your false belief. It can ruin your life only if it ruins your character. Otherwise, it cannot harm you, inside or out. The beauty of it all is our ability to take a pledge for personal responsibility. That's something to be hopeful for. This should make us hopeful and those around you hopeful when witnessing being free from mental enslavement. See, we can free ourselves from victimhood by understanding the responsibility in our own choices. Where you work, what you buy, what you read, what people you surround yourself with, what attitude you take towards life. Those are choices only you can make. When we start taking personal responsibility, you realise life is fun. Life is too short to take every decision so seriously. Work with what you can control. He who laughs at himself never runs out of things